Okay, we'll see if we see anything profound, and then he can just watch it later. Yeah. But let me go ahead and start with the word prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for just the opportunity that we have to gather to talk about your word. We pray, Lord, that as we talk about the prophets, that you would just help us to understand, that you would help us to not look at it just simply for the sake of knowledge, but that we would seek to understand what the prophets were saying to us that would change our lives, how they point us to Christ. We pray, Heavenly Father, that you just give us an understanding of what it is that your word does in us. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. So, got a number of questions that we can discuss this morning. One of them is more general, and that is the role of Deuteronomy in the prophets. It's a topic that is somewhat debated, but not debated. In that, similar to what we talked about last night with Adam and Eve, and we've got references of Eden, but we've only got the one reference in Hosea of the fall and the failure of Adam. We don't have a whole lot of direct quotations from Deuteronomy. We tend to have almost a synthesizing of Deuteronomy, although Jeremiah seems to have more themes related to Deuteronomy than some of the other ones. But kind of thinking back through the book of Deuteronomy and then thinking about the prophets, can you think of areas in the prophets where we see this foundation of Deuteronomy? Or maybe another way to put that would be, if you were going to look at Deuteronomy and then look at the prophets, and you were going to start with the assumption that the prophets are building off of Deuteronomy, what would you expect to see made explicit from Deuteronomy? What elements from Deuteronomy would you expect to show up in the prophets, if that's what they were building off of?
As I was reading Malachi, I kind of got the sense that it wasn't mentioned because Malachi thought they should know it. Almost like at least the priest, they should have known their rules given in the old covenant, because he mentions, I think, the covenant with your forefather. I don't know if he words it like that, but it's almost as if he references the covenant and it's like, well, you should know this,
right?
So repent of doing what you know you should have done, because when he talks to the people, he's like, well, you haven't been taught what you should do, you're still sinning. The priest should have told you what they should have known from the law of God. So I don't know, maybe the role is I think it's sometimes a sense that it's assumed that it should be known, and they're actually, when they're bringing the covenant lawsuit, it's you're being condemned because you know what to do, but you're not doing it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, it's not made explicit, because why would you don't need to quote chapter and verse if they know it. You're right, especially one of the Clement books. He's actually, the name of the book is Prophecy and Covenant, and he's one of the ones that really emphasizes this idea of covenant. But you're right, even then there's a general sense of covenant, that there is a covenant, you have broken the covenant, but there's not necessarily a specific, you didn't build a guardrail around your roof, therefore you're going into exile. There's more of a just a general sense. Yeah, that's a good point. More of a general approach to the covenant rather than specific tenets of it. Yeah.
I think the theme of blessing and cursing Deuteronomy carries forward.
Yeah.
And that's connected to it.
Yep. Yeah, there's a couple places where it's referenced specifically. The withholding of rain shows up a couple times, right, especially in Hosea, in chapter 1 and maybe even into chapter 2. when he talks about basically he wants to make it miserable enough for her that she says, I'll return to my husband because it was better for me then. So you've definitely got mention there of this idea of cursing and of blocking up her way with thorns and those sort of references. Haggai talks about it explicitly. He's post-exilic, but he does talk about it explicitly when he points at the, you have no rain, you have, the crops are bad, and that's because you haven't rebuilt the temple. Even though that's not specifically part of the covenant, but at least the cursing part of it is there. Yeah. What else would you maybe expect to see?
I think you would expect to see them on the law
Mm-hmm.
and not just the ceremony, the law, social law.
Mm-hmm.
Interact with each other and with foreigners in the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you had to sum that up, maybe in a great commandment, what would that great commandment be?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's really one of the more fascinating parts about the prophets is that they're building off of these assumptions, but they don't, like Jeremiah said, they don't necessarily quote chapter and verse.
Right.
I can't think of very many places where they stop and say, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, the Lord your God, our hearts are one straight. They don't really go there, but they do go there.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of undergirding assumption, especially, Hosea and Gomer, this idea of love, Ezekiel 16, he kind of talks about finding her as an orphan, the two sisters, and kind of alluring them and marrying them, and you've got those references, and then the expectations of, well, you will love God back, and then love for neighbor. And in some ways, the love for neighbor is even the one that's addressed more,
Right.
Which is kind of fascinating.
Justice.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah, it is weird that, as much as those are thematically present, like those things are never quoted,
Mm-hmm.
drawn out.
Yep. The popular theory, one of the things that makes Old Testament scholarship so difficult is the number of non-Christians that are studying Old Testament. There are times, and I'm sure it might actually be the case, not just my assumption, but there are times where it feels like there are more scholars in Old Testament that are secular than there are scholars writing a New Testament, because the New Testament is not viewed as much as by secular scholarship as an ancient book. It is, but it isn't. It's blatantly Christian. People don't like Christians, so we don't study it. And if they do, it's more an ethical system, and usually it's co-opted by lesbian studies and lesbian interpretations of Paul and such. So you don't find it as much. Whereas in the Old Testament, they really want to know what it says, because their assumption is speaking only to Jews, and we all love Jews. So go Israel, and so everybody's okay with that, and it's this discussion of, okay, how do we deal with that? And the more popular, if you want to put that, the more popular scholars who tried to discount the Old Testament were in Germany pre-World War II. And now if you even dare mention that, you're basically assumed to be a Nazi. So you can't go anti-Old Testament in Old Testament scholarship, but you can write about crazy ideas in Old Testament scholarship. And that kind of taints all Old Testament scholarship. So, new perspectives is a big deal within the evangelical world, but it doesn't really taint New Testament scholarship. You can write New Testament and not mention new perspectives. Old Testament, you've got these major theories that have just kind of ruled the day for a long period of time. And as Christian writers, we have to interact with them, unfortunately. They kind of have a shelf life. So, we had JEDP, the source theory for Genesis, that it's 4 different documents. That's really fallen out of vogue. Now we're down to about 2. A Deuteronomistic writer and a priestly writer, and that they took pre-existing documents, put them together. You got the Deuteronomistic history, which is the Deuteronomist who wrote Deuteronomy, also wrote everything from Joshua through Kings. And then the one that affects the prophets the most is that you've got this theory that Deuteronomy shows up in Josiah, and that's the first time anybody's ever seen it. What law they were following before that, who knows? But apparently there was no book of the law until Josiah sits down, takes these groups of laws, puts them in the book, and then finds it in the temple. And so one of the theories is we don't see Deuteronomy mentioned because it's not written yet. And so that's why it's not explicit. It's just there's these implicit themes, but then the Deuteronomist, when he wrote Deuteronomy, or whoever Josiah got to write it, put those themes into a book form. So I don't quote chapter and verse because there is no chapter and verse. And there is a point as you hear that theory, it fits the data. It's bonkers, but it fits the data because you don't see them quoting chapter and verse. But then again, you don't really see anybody in the Old Testament quoting chapter and verse unless it's Micah quoting Isaiah or Isaiah quoting Micah. You don't really see that ever. It's not really until the New Testament where we kind of get into this chapter and verse, quoting the prophets. But there are clearly allusions to the rest of the Old Testament, even to Genesis and even to Exodus and to Kings but nobody ever quotes the covenant with David explicitly. The word house, I will build him a sure house, maybe shows up once or twice in the prophets. And even then, it's not the house that's fallen, it's the booth that's fallen, and it's the tree that's been cut down. And they use all these other different metaphors than even David, but they understand what the covenant with David is, but they've chosen different metaphors. David's metaphor fit because he wanted to build God a house. He says, no, I'll build you a house. But it's almost as though they view it as, well, but the house part is more almost figurative, and that it's this lineage, and we can use any metaphor we want. So they clearly know that one, and I don't know of anybody who would make the argument that we don't have 1st and 2nd Samuel as the prophets are writing. Everybody knows that story, and they clearly know that story. But even then, they don't quote chapter verse. So it shouldn't really surprise us to have them referencing Deuteronomy and not having chapter and verse, because they don't do that. Yeah.
Could it be that the absence is the point, almost, that the depravity is so bad, purposely not, it's not being brought up in society at all. So the prophets are not going to take time to read the law because no one will listen.
Right.
And I don't know if maybe the absence is supposed to point us to this is how bad it is. You've read about when they obeyed the law and read the law, and this is how bad it is.
Yeah.
After the exile.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to think of, if the law is found in the temple during the time of Josiah, he doesn't even know what it is. He has to go to the prophetess and say, what is this thing? Well, this is the law of God. This is the blessings and curses that are going to come on you. But Jeremiah has already been ministering during the time of Josiah and in the previous kings, but apparently he was doing so without a book of the law, which is, even there of Deuteronomy's written, but it's in the dust in the back storeroom somewhere for some of that time period. So what covenant then is he calling people to? Yeah.
Could it also be historical circumstances where prior to the exile, the center of everything was the temple? And the temple at that time was basically an abattoir. You go there with your animal, you watch it get flayed and sacrificed, you get some of the meat, you leave, And there's no like, let's sit down and hear a sermon.
Right.
So all the teaching people are getting is coming in the context of their tribe.
Yep.
You know, our fathers are teaching us. So you get the ideas, the concepts, but you don't have a Bible here.
Right.
The only people that have those are the priests of the temple, and they're not really taking the time to preach sermon.
Right.
But then in exile, you don't have the land. You don't have the only thing you have is the word. So suddenly we have synagogue teaching. That's when you start quoting chapter and verse.
Yes.
So prior to that, you know the ideas of the law.
And
it's part of when you stand up, when you lie down, when you walk by the way, you talk about it, but you don't have the book.
That's
to
it.
say, "Here it is."
Yes. Yeah, nobody pushes back against the prophets and says, whoa, 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 what covenant are we talking about here?
Yeah.
They all know, and nobody is shocked by it. If anything, they know enough of it that they're overconfident. Because when the prophets tell them you're going to be destroyed, you're going to go into exile, they're not believed. But they're not believed in part because they really think that it's going to, that's going to work out well for them.
Yeah.
But you'd only have that assumption if you knew there was some sort of covenant foundation. And you're right, you would have gotten that from your tribe. So that even if, they find the book of the law, there probably aren't that many copies of it to begin with. So they find the copy, not just a copy. I mean, it is a copy, but it's the copy. There aren't that many of them. And you're right, it would have been orally transmitted out in the tribes rather than them just getting up and reading it. We don't have that many readings of the law. We have Ezra that does it after the exile. They're supposed to read it at the major festivals, but it doesn't appear that they are. But even then, Joshua, when he comes into the promised land, he puts the covenant on a stone. He whitewashes it, he puts a covenant on it, but he probably doesn't write the whole book of Deuteronomy. Right. He's probably writing maybe chapter 5, the 10 Commandments. Maybe he's writing chapter 26 and 27, 28, the blessings and the curses. Cursed are those who do this, this, and this. But in terms of a national document that lays out the full covenant, he's probably not putting all that on the rock. So it's not so much that Josiah found something that people were completely unfamiliar with. It's just he saw, he found the larger document. They knew pieces of it. So they can't play the ignorance card. They can't say, well, we didn't know what you were talking about. The prophets know that they know, because you're right, it's part of their national identity, it's part of who they are as tribes. The information has been passed on, maybe not in the great detail of, are they quoting word for word the book of Deuteronomy within their tribes? Probably not. But they are aware of the general rules and regulations. They're probably even aware of the general regulations in terms of the I think the term apodictic word, the laws, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt do this. They almost know it the way that we know OSHA regulations. We have a general idea, even in our society, we have a general idea of what it is that OSHA requires. And we kind of know that, we often use the term OSHA approved. OSHA doesn't approve anything, but we use that term OSHA approved. We kind of know what's okay and what's not. When we see exposed wires, we know that that's not in code. We can kind of look at something that that's not code, but we can't quote, well, that's not code because of section 103.A-C subtitle F. We don't know that, but we have a general idea of what it is. And I think you're right, Rick. It's a similar idea in the tribes of we have this sense of, okay, I need a parapet around the edge of my roof. I'm going to go up on the roof. if my donkey falls or if my bull gores the guy's donkey, we kind of know what happens. When it comes to land sales, I know I can't sell my land outside the tribe. Just those general ideas they were aware of. So there's enough to condemn them, because even the bit that they know, they're not following. So if somebody comes to your house and says, that's against code, there's a lot of times that we say, oh, I didn't know the code. But there's some times that we know. Maybe not specific, but we know.
I just thought of this: would the elders of the city who make the judgments, would they be expected to know? Sort of like the ocean inspectors.
Yeah.
Maybe the people don't know every job.
I would think so, because you still got layers of judges and layers of elders in each town, and they would at least know enough that they could pass it on. A good example would probably be during the time of the judges. By then they're not following the law. They've completely forgotten it. They're not paying attention to it. And yet Ruth mentions the tradition of taking the sandal off and giving it to the person who won't be the kinsman redeemer. Actually, according to Deuteronomy, you're supposed to spit in his face and say, thus shall be done to the man who won't redeem. I mean, it's a big deal not to redeem somebody. And yet by the time of Ruth, it's, do you want to redeem it? Nah, not interested. Well, there is no not interested in Israel. You are required by the law to redeem Ruth. But by that time, it's become more of an option. They got the little ceremony with the sandal. Boaz marries Ruth, we live happily ever after, and nobody ever thinks anything of it. Nobody thinks, oh, I can't believe that other guy who's not even named, he's cursed. Well, no, we don't even know his name. There's no ill effect for him. It just gets passed over. But the elders supervise the whole thing. They have a general understanding of the way it's supposed to work. And I get that sense of the elders do know more than the people know, but they understand the way that it's supposed to operate. And there's been tweaks here or there as they've forgotten the letter of the law. And we do the same thing. I was talking to somebody the other day, and he said maybe the associate pastor of that church should become the senior pastor when the senior pastor retires. And I said, yeah, except in our book of church order, it's not allowed. He said, what do you mean it's not allowed? I said, well, in our book of church order, in the PCA, it says that the associate pastor is not allowed to become the senior pastor unless the associate pastor leaves and serves another church for at least a year and then comes back and can be the senior pastor. But you can overrule it with an 80% vote. So in the PCA, it's become tradition that the associate pastor becomes the senior pastor when the senior pastor retires, and you just get 80% of your congregation to vote for it, then it's fine. But so when I told him, I said, actually, it's not allowed. We have a friend who's an associate who's applied for the senior pastor position, and we were talking about the detriment to the church if he doesn't get it. Of what if less than 80% of the congregation votes? Then does he stick around as the associate? Now his feelings are hurt. They don't want me to be the senior pastor. So now you lose not one pastor, you lose two pastors. One to retirement, one because his feelings are hurt, he's going to go somewhere else. You guys don't want me, I'm leaving. And I said, well, that's why they have the rule. And he said, what rule? I said, this is exactly why that rule is in place, but nobody knows the rule. We've kind of created our own tradition, and he thought I was pulling his leg. And
That's crazy.
I pulled out my book of church order and I showed him, and he's like, wow, I didn't know that. But nowadays, churches will actually hire an associate, and they will tell the associate, we're hiring you to be the senior pastor in 3 years when the senior pastor retires.
Isn't that what an assistant pastor is supposed to be though? Generally, I mean,
In our
hired by the session,
right.
with the intention that they may succeed.
Yeah, in our polity, the assistant pastor position has been a holdover from the old system of we don't have to ask the congregation's permission. We can just do what we want as the session.
Yeah.
So it kind of eliminates some paperwork, and we can get the young guy to be the assistant. He doesn't have a vote on session, so we can tell him what to do. But again, I think the intent was something else originally, but that's what we've made it. And there's nothing in our BCO that explicitly says why we have assistants. Some people have suggested that assistants were created within the PCA because you could have a split on a session around the time the PCA was formed, where the assistants or the associate pastors might be more liberal than the senior pastor, and he would get outvoted on session. And so to eliminate that problem, they left that assistant pastor position in, but it's probably not the way it was intended, but that's what it's become, and that's how we use it. So we've got these rules and regulations that are set up for a particular way, and we've used it in a completely different way, just kind of tweaking it over time. And either the letter of the law didn't explain it well enough, and nobody remembers because that collective memory is gone from the 70s when it was formed. There is a written commentary on our Book of Church Order, but I don't know if anybody who has a copy, and I don't know anybody who reads it, but there is one somewhere. Morton Smith wrote a commentary on each of them. In fact, we say in our denomination, we say you can participate in the Lord's Supper if you're a member in good standing of an evangelical church. And yeah, so we say of a evangelical gospel proclaiming church. Well, according to Morton Smith, who helped write the Book of Church Order, that word evangelical is in there to mean not Catholic. And the whole idea was if you believe in transubstantiation, you can't take communion. That's why the phrase is in there. So it has nothing to do with gospel proclaiming. It has nothing to do with are you liberal Lutheran or conservative Lutheran? It has to do with, do you believe in transubstantiation? And I only know that because my dad called him up and asked him, why is this in here? And that's what he said. He's like, basically we wanted non-sacerdotal transubstantiation. We wanted people that had evangelical people would suffer. But that collective memory I know is gone, because I run into guys all the time with no idea why it's in there, and assume, as I did originally, that it's in there. No, it's got to be a gospel church. It can't be just some liberal mainline church somewhere. It's got to be a gospel proclaiming church. But Morton Smith would say, no, you can be a member of a liberal church, take communion with us. That's fine. And we'd be, what, really? You can't come from the metropolitan gay church downtown, take communion here. And Morton Smith would have said, well, yeah, you can, which just horrifies us. But that collective memory is gone. So I think you're right. Israel had done the same thing, but they have enough left that they don't know the specifics necessarily, but they know a general idea of what's required.
I guess that's why the leaders are held to a higher standard. The Lord's like, I'm gonna put better shepherds in here. Who's gonna taking care of my flock? Like,
yes, yeah.
If they're the ones who are more likely to know the law, and then the people don't know because the leaders haven't maintained their responsibility.
Yeah. Micah talks about them saying, we're the cauldron and the people are the meat.
Yeah.
And basically we can take what we want. It sounds very much like First Samuel of them stabbing the fork in and pulling out the meat. It sounds like the same idea. We can take what we want. And God says, no, that's not the law. No. The law was not to do that. They know that they are accusing people of crimes, putting them in prison, sometimes killing them, and then taking their property. Micah's really big on property. And so, we have a couple of references to that of them basically knowingly manipulating the law. So they're not necessarily sitting with the book of regulations in front of them. They don't necessarily know all of Deuteronomy, but they know enough that they are able to know what I'm doing is not right. I'm basically trying to get myself rich as a leader in Israel. And that's not supposed to be the case. I am not supposed to be manipulating the system for my own gain. I'm supposed to be caring for the people. But you're right, there is, even on a local level, with local priests, with local leaders and elders, there's a condemnation of them, even though they don't have a book of Deuteronomy, they know I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah, so in Micah, it's saying here, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. So that's just like more regular kind of tribal.
I think it would
Heads,
certainly
right?
include them.
Yeah.
Yep. So he does condemn kings. And it almost seems to be more that what Huldah, the priest, the prophetess, I said priestess, prophetess, does and explains to Josiah is nationally, you guys are in trouble. And you're the king, national problems are your problem. And yet at the same time, it's not just national big picture issues. It's not just you followed idols, so you're going to go into exile. Now that's present in Deuteronomy. The first 12 chapters deal a lot. Chapter 5 through 12 repeats the idea of idolatry over and over and over again. Don't follow after idols. Don't follow after idols. Don't do as the other nations do. Don't go and offer your sacrifices wherever you want. It's got to be at the temple. It's got to be to God only. It's not by your idols. And then roughly chapter 12, especially in chapter 14 through really chapter 28, 29 is the law as we think of it. But you do have kind of this preamble. You got the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy are kind of a historical prologue. Then you've got this preamble that lays out these principles. Talk about these when you get up, lay down. Love God. That's the summation. Here's the 10 commandments that are the basis for all this. Here's the foundation. Here's the principles. Now here are the laws. And a lot of law books have that same thing. Here are the philosophical assumptions that we're basing this on. Now here's the actual laws. So Israel more or less knows all of it. If you ask the average Israelite, hey, what's in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy? He's going to be not going to know chapter and verse anyway, but he's not going to be able to tell you. But if you walk up to him, hey, can you worship idols? That's an easy one. No. How many gods are there? 1. How many gods can you worship? 1. Where do you worship them? The temple. They know that. So they know what's in that first 12 chapters. And then they know the laws that are in between. They don't always follow them, but they kind of have a loose idea. They somewhat understand how the festivals are supposed to be run. They understand, those regulations. But then Josiah picks up the law, reads the whole thing, and understands the whole notion of exile. And that seems to be the real part that had been forgotten, is within the blessings and curses, they understood to a degree, they understood if we don't serve God, we get bad weather. They got that to a point. But this idea that Israel could go into exile is explicitly there in the law, in the blessings and curses. Because God tells them, not only will I send you off into exile, God also tells you I will bring you back. So there's the punishment, but there's also the return. So you've got that idea is there, but that seems to be part of what had been forgotten, is that it's possible for Israel to leave. So that as Amos shows up on the scene, really the difference, the transformation that he makes in Old Testament prophecy is that big picture involves destruction and exile. Because he keeps saying, you keep wanting the day of the Lord. You keep wanting this day of judgment. Why? Why do you want this? Well, you want this because you assume it's going to be on the nations. And as Amos starts, he just lambasts the nations for several chapters for these 3 things and for 4, and he just really beats on all the nations.
Their brothers.
Yeah. And they, to a point, most of those nations that are dealt with harshly, the harshest, are people who messed with Israel or Israel's allies. So the king of the Edomites messed with, it's actually the bones of the kings of Edom are the ones that are burnt to salt by one of the other nations. So he picks on the Edomites, but the Edomites are still allies of Israel. So not only does he pick on the Edomites, but he picks on the other nation who messed with the Edomites, and actually says, you're going to be destroyed because you messed with Edom. Edom is wicked, they're going to be destroyed too. But you messed with Edom, you can't do that. They're allied with Israel. And the motivation really behind the attack, most historians think, was because of the fact they were aligned with Israel. I can't hurt Israel, so we're hit the Edomites. And God says, no, I'm going to curse you for that. So Israel's reading this and they're like, yeah, justice is being served. This is great. But then when you get to, the sections on Israel and you realize, oh, dang, it's coming for all of us. And it's really because they have forgotten this idea of exile. It's as though they didn't even think about it, which is a pretty major chunk of Deuteronomy. It seems like a significant part to have forgotten. But that theme is not a new theme when Amos brings it up. He mentions the idea of a remnant. He doesn't use that word. If he uses it, it's rare. It's a far more common word in Isaiah. Usually we associate remnant with Isaiah because of how many times he uses the word. But it does show up. The idea shows up at least in Amos. There'll be a little bit here, he says, and a little bit there. We're going to burn the house down, but hey, you can have your couch. These little pieces. We're going to save you out of the mouth of the lion or the mouth of the bear, but basically we're going to save one arm and a leg, and the rest of it is going to be destroyed.
Yeah, that's so weird.
Yeah. But he's got that great passage of, well, it's going to be like the man who went into a house and leaned against a wall and took a break because he thought he'd survived, and a snake comes out of the wall and bites him. Some great metaphors and analogies there of the day of judgment is going to spill over into Israel too. Maybe not as severe as it comes upon the nations because they're utterly wiped out. There's a remnant that's saved, but still it's not good. It's not great. But I think up until that point, nobody had really suggested the idea that you could have exile.
Interesting, because it seems like in the New Testament, the religious leaders, they have the opposite problem. It's we can make ourselves righteous by our actions.
Yep.
And neither was the point of the law, was to make them holy, but there was no system of merit. But at the same time, you can't forget that you can still be punished.
Right.
So it seems like the exile makes them go to the opposite extreme after that, and they become legalist instead of not wanting to do anything at all.
Yes.
To the point where they're creating their own laws, and they miss the point twice, even when Christ comes.
Yes.
So that I find that interesting that when Christ comes, they don't have the same problem.
Right. Yeah, it's a completely different problem. Yeah, a number of people have commented on the fact that if Jesus had been born in the era of the prophets, he would have fit right in. He would have been a crazy prophet and people would have just dismissed him. Or he would have been, in their minds, blaspheming and saying he's God, and that wouldn't have bothered them either. They would have just added him right in. So the fact that he shows up in this time of reaction against what happened in Babylon and the intervening years between Old and New Testament, that he shows up in that period, and they can't handle it. They have to crucify him. That's the only way they know to deal with the problem.
Maybe that's one of the reasons we talked about it last. Maybe that is a reason for the intertestamental period almost. It's they needed time.
Yeah.
To have to react to crucify, because like you said, they probably would not have crucified him if he came born earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, they're really synthesizing why are we overrun by nations? We came out of exile from Babylon, and we thought that we were going to have this glorious time, the restoration. Where is it? Well, apparently we weren't holy enough when we came out of exile. And so we've got to be holy enough so that we can have the restoration. But I think you're right that a lot of that analysis took place among the rabbinic schools. Even Ben Sira is a writer in that kind of intertestamental period. I think he's the one in the Catholic books. It's called The Wisdom of Solomon. It's the same book, either the Wisdom of Solomon or the Wisdom of Ben Sira. He basically equates wisdom with following the law, which is a development within wisdom literature, because Old Testament wisdom literature, if you are wise, you will follow the law, but if you follow the law, you're not necessarily wise. Wisdom is bigger than that. But by the time you get near the time of Christ, wisdom is just following the law. Don't ask questions, just follow the law. And even then, within their wisdom, they make a fence around the law. So, you've got all these other laws that show up to protect them from breaking the actual law, because that's what's most important. But you're right, they've gone the other extreme. And it is a reaction to what takes place in that intertestamental period, what takes place after the exile. They're almost afraid, I think, that Jesus is going to spark another exile, and they don't want to risk that.
Yeah.
And so the way to protect against that is to be legalists. And
yeah, because in John, I just read John 11 this week. And, after Jesus raises Lazarus, that's when the plot intensifies to kill them. But they say, then the Romans will come and take away our place and our nation. So yeah, it's kind of that idea of exile.
Yep. Which unfortunately happens anyway. But they really thought they could.
We were right.
Yes, we were right. We did cause that. Yeah. Yeah, they wanted to prevent that, and they thought that was the best way to go about it, was to be extra legalists.
It seems like the pendulum swings also. Like their problem in the New Testament wasn't they didn't worship one God. It's in the Old Testament, it's let's worship all the gods of the Canaanites, and let's do it. And that was kind of, we went into exile because of that. You see the division of the temple, and all these cults in the temple worship God. And by the New Testament, it seems like they really get the point that there's one God. But they've kind of swung to the extreme of he's one God who belongs to us.
Yes.
Right. This is not a house of prayer for the nation. Like I say, it's a house for us, and let's kill the Gentiles. So it's like they took the right idea and then they ran with it.
Yes.
All the way. Well, no, that's the goal here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like
yeah, instead of being a light to the Gentiles, I think they began to assume that the Gentiles had perverted them.
Yeah.
And they've got this idea of almost super holiness that they have to achieve. And the way to do that is to separate yourself from the nations, to separate yourself from Gentiles. Gentiles are evil, they're dirty, they'll contaminate us. And yet, even Haggai talks about, does if you put a piece of clean meat in a dirty garment, does it become dirty? You're like, yeah, of course. He says, yeah, you're the problem. you're the unclean. So, even then, they as I read Haggai, I almost feel like I'm reading an interaction with Pharisees. It sounds very much like a conversation Jesus would have had with the Pharisees, and whitewashed tombs and picking up that theme. But you're right, they've gone so far the other extreme that they have stopped any sort of missionary activity. They've stopped any perception that all the nations on earth would be blessed through us. Instead, it's just about us. There is only one God. We don't share him. There's only one God. We know exactly who he is and what he's like and his character. And don't you dare try to tell us that we don't have it right.
But even like Peter, when he goes to Cornelius, because God called him there, he tells them, you know that I am a Jew and it's unlawful for me to eat Gentile. God has called me. And I remember the first time someone pointed out to me, there's no law that says you can't eat Gentile. No, in fact, you're supposed to welcome the foreigners in and feed them.
Right.
But they had, kind of gotten that said, this is a sin for me to even fellowship with you at all.
Yeah.
This thing that it built up.
Yeah, and I mean, the church does the same thing.
Yes.
We're too much like the world, or cut ourselves off from the world.
Right.
Yeah,
we almost try to make this this righteous enclave of somehow a bastion of purity, and yet the message of the prophets was never drive out all those other people. it was always, you're the problem. And yet they didn't get that message. I mean, that's probably one of the sadder things about the Israel's interaction with the prophets. They don't get the the issue is them, that it's a heart issue, right? Which the prophets got. You know, the valley of dry bones, write this covenant on your heart, the new covenant, all of those. Take your heart of stone, give your heart of flesh. All those great passages are really dealing with, you're the issue. The issue is within you. I'm reminded of the Simpsons always says their treehouse of horror, they call it, on Halloween, and they're hilarious. They're some of the best Simpsons episodes are around Halloween. I haven't watched Simpsons in years, but they would actually release the Halloween specials on video, and they're really good. And I remember the one was they get abducted by aliens. The whole Simpson family gets abducted by aliens, and these aliens are being super nice to them. And they find a book that says how to cook humans, and so they freak out. And they're really mean to the aliens to the point that the aliens don't want them around anymore. And the aliens explain to them that actually the cover is dusty. It's how to cook for humans. And they prepared this beautiful buffet for all and then there's this kind of comedic interaction where they keep brushing off the title and it keeps showing more. So then it says how to cook 40 humans, and then no, how to cook for 40 humans, and they keep showing more. But eventually, after that little gag is over, it was going to be a positive thing. And so I can always picture Lisa. She looks at the Simpsons family and she says, "We have met the evil, and the evil is us." And that's how it ends. And it's a great satire on just human nature. But whenever I think about that, I always picture Lisa. We have met the evil. The evil is us. That's really what the prophets were trying to get across, and yet the people don't get it. They're convinced the problem is them. So let's keep them out, because we're true sons of Abraham. We're the true Israelites. And it's not even just the Pharisees. There's several groups. There's the Dead Sea Scroll community, the Ad Qumran, potentially the Essenes. That's the leading theory that's who lives at Qumran at that time, and they're more separatists. Of the problem is not just Gentiles. The problem is the rest of Israel. So we'll go out in the wilderness and we'll be the true Israel, and the 200 or so of us will be extra holy. And then God will come and save us. And that doesn't work so well either. But yeah, you definitely have this shifting perspective, but it has no basis in the prophets. They've missed the point. They got the message, they just didn't understand it. The message was, you're not holy. But they came to the conclusion that means we're gonna get rid of everybody else. Which in a sense, I think it's almost like they're blaming the nations for their idolatry. The nations led us astray. So we need to get rid of the nations. That way we're not led into idolatry again.
Yeah. This kind of roughly connects well or not, but in the biblical theology class, we have to read Meredith Klein on the Mosaic Covenant. And this would be my pushback against him. It seems like Israel in the New Testament views the Mosaic Covenant as a covenant of works, and not as a dispensation of God's grace.
Yes.
And if you are to take, it looks like if you abuse the covenant of Moses and make it a covenant of works, you would get that reaction. Well, we have to be so holy that I have to make myself holy because I caused God to punish me by my disobedience. I merited that. Right. And when we take it out of, well, no, this is God's grace. It is to be holy. The point is not to live in continual perpetual sin. Right. It seems like, I don't know, and it seems like Klein takes that position of a Pharisaical position almost. And I could see that danger. I don't know if that just kind of struck me as you were talking about it. It's like,
Mhm.
this is why it's so important that it's a part of the covenant of grace,
Right.
because if it's not, oh, legalism is right there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's one of the difficulties even with the new perspectives of the new perspectives, I think, is picking up. I would almost call it the new perspective of Phariseeism rather than the new perspectives of Paul, because it's the very thing that Paul is writing against. He's destroyed this idea of merit, because the new perspectives, if you want to call it that, is not that new. It's the perspective of the Judaizers. It's the perspective of those Pharisees, of this idea of he calls it covenant nomism. You're in the covenant until you sin enough and then you're out. And scholars keep saying there's no record of that anywhere, and there isn't. But that seems to be how the Pharisees are functioning. Of, well, you're not a true Israelite because you don't follow the covenant, therefore you're out. And Paul has to come along and say, no, actually that's not how it works. So it is hilarious to hear this new perspectives on Paul when that's the very thing Paul's writing against. Guy Waters, I think, explains that well. Of no, actually it's the opposite. But you kind of see what Wright is picking up on if he focuses on the Pharisees. This idea of there is no justification by faith. Faith doesn't matter. It's just merited holiness. And you're right. That's if you take the covenant with Moses as less than grace and more as you must do this, then yeah, you end up with legalism, which is a shame because it misses the unconditional election of Israel, which is one of my favorite themes in the prophets, that almost all the prophets end with this element of hope. Even Amos ends with this element of hope, and Hosea ends with an element of hope, and Isaiah ends with a huge element of hope. That you tend in some of the other prophets like Obadiah and Nahum that are writing towards non-Israelite communities, there's not a whole lot of hope. But even then, there's sometimes elements of, well, they'll all come to Israel. That Israel is the hope, because Israel's not going anywhere. And it is one of the fascinating things about world history, even that we have in Israel right now, we have a secular state. We do not have Old Testament Israel. We have, I don't even know what to call it, 1948 Israel. And yet we do have a lineage, if you want to call it, going back to ancient Israel. There aren't a lot of people on earth that can claim that. Yeah. Egyptians they're not descendants of ancient Egyptians. Probably somewhere in Egypt there are, but by and large, they've been overrun so many times. It's something different. Ethiopia, it's not really the same as the ancient kingdom of Cush. They're not the same people. There's just been wars and people running over people, and we don't have a lot of ancient peoples that are the same. And yet Israel is still around. And that has always struck me that, here we are, thousands of years later, thousands of years after the Old Testament has been written, thousands of years since the New Testament has been written, plenty of opportunity for Israel to disappear, which would certainly create all sorts of problems for us.
Yeah.
And yet they're still here. They haven't gone anywhere.
Yeah.
They're not the state that they used to be. They've intermarried with a lot of nations, and yet Jews are still Jews. And
there's like a bubble of protection that no one really knows. I mean, we do, but
yeah,
culturally, it's like, well, you can't touch them. They're Jews. You can't mess with them.
Yep.
Or if you ask someone why, I don't know.
Yeah. And even the fact that we, more or less from the year 70 AD until 1948, there wasn't a state of Israel. And yet in 1948, when the Zionist movement really reached its zenith and we ended up having the state of Israel, there was never this question of, well, who's going to live there? Let's create the ancient kingdom of Cush. Well, who's going to live there? I don't know. We'll go find somebody. No, we had all these thousands, millions of people around the world that are like, oh, I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
And showed back up, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're still here. You were scattered among the nations, Russia, Poland, all over, and yet They're still here, and they're here enough that Hitler knew exactly who to target. And the Russians, when they would have their pogroms or pogroms, however you say that word, and they would target Russian Jews, they knew who to target. They knew who the Jews were. That the Jews have always been somewhat separatistic enough that you knew who they were. When the United States gets into a financial crisis, they know who to go to in New York. You go to the New York Jews because we know who they are. New York Italians, the Irish, we kind of know who they are, but the Jews have maintained that cultural identity and have been pretty distinct and still here all these years later. So, as much as dispensationalism has overemphasized ethnic Israel, we can't dismiss it completely and say that God doesn't have a plan for ethnic Israel. There's clearly been a preservation of the Jews, even to the point of Romans 9 through 11 about the Jews coming back to Christ. Yeah. I had somebody several years ago, an elder who's no longer here, he moved to Florida, but an elder here at Westminster said, I think we should start praying for Israel in our Sunday morning prayers. And I was, young and naive at the time, and I was like, not praying for Israel. We are not a dispensationalist fundamentalist Baptist church. We are not. That's not us. We're Presbyterian. We don't do that. And then I picked up Ian Murray's book on revivals and revivalism. And the debate among the Puritans was not whether or not we need to evangelize Israel or pray for Israel. The question was, when Israel repents, was that the end of time? And that was the big debate they had, was it, Romans, where there's the turning of Israel and then it's the end? Or is it there's a turning of Israel and then it's not the end? But for them, it was always an assumed of course we should pray for Israel. And of course we should, so then I sheepishly had to be like, okay, maybe we can pray for Israel. We tend not to, just because nobody thinks of it. But, it is fascinating to think that even in this country, for several hundred years, even the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists and those from a Reform background still had this understanding there's a plan for Israel, and we're praying for that. And yet, thanks to Darby and Schofield and dispensationalism, there's been an overreaction against that within Reformed churches. So, well, we can't pray for Israel. Everybody think we're dispensationalists. And so we just don't talk about Israel. Kind of like Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno. We don't talk about Israel.
That's like,
yeah, we don't talk about Israel. Yeah, kind of that same idea of it's we don't mention it because we're not those people. Right. Yeah. But yet you do have that covenant that continues.
It's kind of interesting because I came to the Reformed faith, I guess in the early 2000s, but it was a lot of influence from Gary DeMar, those sorts of guys, and so I always had kind of in my mind, I'm post-millennial, so I've always thought that conversion of Israel was a normal thing for Reformed Presbyterian people, because that's just kind of the way I came into it. And then reading Benjamin's book, The Hope of the Future, The Promise of the Future, and he's talking about that particular topic, and he says that was the norm for the Puritans. That kind of fell out of favor, and now you mostly only see it in sort of the branches of the Reform world coming off the Reconstruction. I'm like, well, that is kind of the background of our church.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize, are you seeing it becoming a more broad
not really
idea again, or is
it should? Yeah. But when we talk about Romans 9 through 11, it's just so we can prove predestination. We don't usually use it to talk about Israel, but we should. It's funny, we had a missionary that came to our church in Wisconsin and did a Seder meal for us. He didn't do the actual meal, he just explained it. And I asked him, I said, are you a missionary in Israel? Oh yeah, I'm in Israel. And I said, do you have any converts? And, among the Jews, is that a pretty hard thing? And he said, we don't have any converts. And he kind of looked at me like, that's a dumb question. Why would you even ask that? So I asked him, I said, well, what do you mean? And he's like, well, what do you mean? What do I mean? Why is this confusing? And he said, Paul said that, there's a hardening of the Israelites. There's no converts. Why would I expect converts? And I said, well, why are you there? And he said, because Paul said that there will be an opening of the eyes of the Jews and that they will turn in mass, and I want to be there. And he said, so I'm there in the hopes that I'm there when it happens. And he said, that's why I'm a missionary in Israel, that I have Jewish ancestry and I want to be part of that. And so I'm there strategically in case it's now. But he said, yeah, I don't expect a lot of converts. He said, yeah, we got some, but no, I don't expect this huge revival, but I do expect a huge revival. And I want to be there when it happens. And I thought that's an interesting viewpoint of that's not typically how we view it, but it is how we should view it.
Right.
It's why McShane, Robert Murray McShane started, it still exists, started a missions organization sending missionaries to Israel. And it's still around. I forget what it's called, but there is still this organization that sends missionaries over there because of that very idea of we have this promise that someday they're going to return. And again, the easiest way to disprove Romans is for there to be no Jews left.
Right.
And people have tried. The Russians have tried, the Germans have tried, lots of people have tried. And now that we have it kind of politicized of you got to play nice with Israel, now churches are afraid to talk about it because you don't want to seem like those people. In fact, there's a Jewish congregation here in town, Jewish Christian congregation called Hope for Israel. And I'm actually the cross-country coach at RBCS with the pastor's wife. And it's funny, his name is Keller, Maynard Keller. He ran for office just recently. He's a good guy. He's funny though, he fits every stereotype of a Jew. And, so he was telling me that kind of the history of that church, he did one of those ancestry.com things and it comes back that he's mostly Jewish. And I'm looking at him, I'm like, you needed an ancestry. I could have told you that. He's got the dark hair, he's tall, he fits all the stereotypical physical features. He's in finance. I'm like, come on, you're like a walking stereotype. And he's like, yeah, I've only known I was Jewish for 6 years. Like, that is hilarious. That is the funniest thing anybody's ever told me. You didn't know you were Jewish. It's like when you looked in the mirror, what did you think you were? It's, you got a good German name. Everything, he's from Pennsylvania. He fits, he checks all the boxes. But even on their website, it says you have to believe that the land belongs to Israel. But that's part of that kind of dispensational holdover. And, my pushback would almost be, I don't agree that Palestine belongs to Israel. I think the prophets teach the whole world belongs to Israel. So, why settle for Palestine? The new heavens and new earth, it's all yours. And we've been grafted in. So it's ours, but the whole world's been promised to you. So, let's not settle for a strip of land in Palestine. But, that's kind of been this dispensational movement of, let's focus on the land. Let's focus on secular Israel, 1948, got to protect Israel. And even our foreign policy in the United States is largely affected by that. And yet the pushback has not been, well, let's look at the prophets and look at Israel and look at the covenant that comes from Deuteronomy and look at the unconditional nature of it and believe there's a plan for Israel. Instead, we've just said, nope, it's not that. Some of what we talked about last night with some of the other things that we've just said, no, I disagree with that. Well, what do you believe? I don't know, but it's not that.
It's interesting that the prophets is what's been pushing me more post-mill, honestly, because of Isaiah tends, I think, fits well with that Romans 9 through 11. The knowledge of the Lord is going to cover the earth. Earth is Israel. So it's like in the thickness of that meaning, it seems like we should expect God to be known throughout the world. We should expect him, the knowledge of him to be increasing almost. Like there should be an anticipation that I think we don't often have. Even on millennial, why it seems like we've lost the anticipation that God is putting his enemies under his feet. He is
Yes.
spreading his knowledge, because that seems to be a theme even in Paul.
Yes.
He's like, he mentions it a lot. He's like, right now, Christ is putting his enemies under his feet.
Right.
Right now, the knowledge of God is increasing throughout the nations. And it's like,
Yeah.
even when I don't see it, it seems like something the prophets expected people to expect. It's like, all right, I don't.
Yes.
It's interesting that in the church, we tend to be very
Pessimistic.
pessimistic, and
Yes.
it's like, well, the knowledge of God should be decreasing. That's what's right.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't think any of the prophets would agree. I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to call myself an optimistic amillennialist.
Yeah.
In that, there's up until probably 100 years ago, amillennialism was called postmillennialism.
Yeah.
Literal postmillennialism, because they thought it ended in the 1700s. But the general idea was still this optimism that the gospel was going to continue to go forward. And I tend to think of, if the church is shrinking, how does that cause conflict with Satan? Because in the United States, church is shrinking. He doesn't care. He's happy. Why is he in conflict? But when the church is doing well, that's what creates conflict. I almost see the movement of the church and the kingdom expanding, and Satan feels threatened. And that it's as the church goes forward and as the kingdom expands and the church expands, that's what causes the conflict. Because, almost like the game, what's it called, Concentration, where you had the spring. It was a spring with the different red and blue pieces, and you pull out the pieces, but if you pulled out the wrong one, then the whole thing snapped and all the pieces went flying. And love that game. But although we played that, when I was a kid, I was allowed to wiggle them, and you could find the loose ones. And as I got older, I wasn't allowed to wiggle them anymore. And then you had to kind of use your eyes to pick the right one. But kind of that idea of Satan is getting, his territory is shrinking to the point that it creates this conflict. But you're right, if we have a pessimistic view and the church is getting smaller and smaller, he's more relaxed, he doesn't care.
Right.
You lose influence. So it does sound like from the prophets, we should expect this optimism of the church is going to go forward. And we do have ups and downs. Even now, we tend to have a very nationalistic view of the church. So, the United States is the only country in the world where the church is not statistically growing.
Yeah.
Which we're all like, the rest of the country's like, the rest of the world's like, so we're growing, what do we care? But, for us as Americans, if the United States isn't growing, the church is pretty much dead. That's our viewpoint. The church around the world, who cares what's going on in Rwanda? The church in the United States is dying. So, the church is doomed. Yes, there's 80 million Christians in China, but we're doomed. We're doomed. We tend to have that viewpoint, but we should expect the church to have ups and downs, but more or less to keep moving forward. And the kingdom to keep moving forward, which it is. It just isn't doing it in the United States.
I think that's a really encouraging thing too.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, we rented from a United Methodist Church for years.
Yeah.
In our building. And, a few years ago, they had their big global conference, and the topic was ordination of homosexuals, ordained gay people. And the American Methodist Church sort of overwhelmingly says yes. But the vote died because of all the African bishops.
Yep. Yes.
Who are more numerous and more conservative. And
oh, absolutely.
Right.
And, so they steered the entire denomination away from that.
Yeah.
Just by virtue. And I'm thinking, it's really great to know that the church in the world isn't dependent on America.
Yeah.
Like if the church crumbles here, it's okay. The global south is exploding. And not just number wise, but faithfulness.
Yes.
Biblical.
Yep.
So I think it's kind of a comfort to know that we're not the indispensable country. God's going to build his church.
Right.
Yeah.
With or without us,
Yeah. Well, even Tim Decker has said that when he tries to get published, he tries to get published in African journals out of South Africa. I said, why? He said, because the future of the church is Africa. So he said, I can write scholarship in the United States, get it published, 3 people will read it. It's not going to make a big difference. He said, but if I can invest in the African church with scholarship, he said, that's where the future of the church is. And I think he's. I
think right now 1 in 4 Christians worldwide is that.
Well, I had an African pastor said, how many churches do you plant a day? I said, well, in the PCA, it's one a month. And it has been since the 80s. We do 50 a year. That's our statistic.
Yeah.
And he just kind of looked at me with like this look of disappointment. I'm so sorry. Because, for them, they're planting them by the day.
Yeah.
They're planting churches.
Yeah, in Rwanda, it's fast. Like the Anglican church, at least, has the parish model. And so, I mean, they'll ordain a guy as a deacon, not even a full priest. And then they'll say, okay, you've got these 3 new plants that you're in charge of. Maybe there will be a priest who's overseeing you who can come in once a month to like check up on you. But I mean, they're just, they cannot plant churches fast enough.
Yeah. I've been trying to, the more I come into contact with retired pastors, and the movement, at least within our presbytery, is when you retire, you go to Africa. So we've got a number of guys who work in Malawi and Gambia, and that's a really good trend. But even my dad was asking, he's like, I'm going to be retired soon. I don't know what to do. He's like, I don't know if I can write. I said, I got a project for you. He's like, what's that? I said, sit down at your computer, open your Bible, Genesis chapter 1, hit record on your computer, just talk for 5 minutes about Genesis 1. When you know what that, do Genesis 2, just upload them to YouTube. I mean, I get calls all the time from African pastors. Are there resources? Are there, there's a lot of bad stuff out there. And, just recognizing that, I told him, I said, invest in Africa. You don't even have to go there. Just put it on YouTube and just make it available to them that we as pastors can say, here it is. When I was in Malawi last September, the pastor asked me, he said, do you have any videos or resources? I said, yeah, I'll send you a link to my YouTube channel. And I've got all my lectures for all the classes that I've done are on there. And at least the ones that not all of them have been put into the format that we're doing here, but I'm working on that. So he comes down to the breakfast table the next morning and he looks at me and says, Kyle, you are a great teacher. And I'm thinking, yeah, I know. Yeah. It's like, so what video were you watching? Elementary Hebrew 1. And I looked at him and I'm like, why? Why would you do that? Of all the things on my YouTube channel you can watch, you watched Elementary Hebrew 1. What is wrong with you? Did you have that much trouble sleeping last night? He'd stayed up like 2 in the morning watching Hebrew lectures. I'm like, what is wrong with you? I can't even get people in the class to watch the lectures. And here's this after, but they're just so hungry that they'll watch anything. And so, yeah, we're definitely seeing a movement in that direction, which is exciting. But yeah, the same is true of the church today as was true of Israel of the Old Testament. Of we have God's covenant promises, and there are times when the church goes through decline. There are times that Israel goes through decline, and one of the things that the post-exilic prophets really wrestle with is how do we put the covenant promises of God for restoration with what we're seeing? And we as a church still struggle with that same idea. And actually, that's how I ended up in Malawi. Last January, we had a member here that decided to leave. And actually, we had several members that decided to leave, but one in particular, it was just a little nasty about it. I don't think they intended to be nasty. They were very just naive. They were young, naive, and basically said they couldn't go to a church where the pastor did not always want to be there 100% of the time. And we had just gone through a very rough patch in 2019. There were a lot of times I didn't want to be here or anywhere. Paul Tripp in his book, Dangerous Calling, talks about when you're standing in subway and you start wondering how much that guy makes an hour and if you can make a living wage off of that, because that sounds better. Sean calls those bread truck Mondays. You see the bread truck, truck. In fact, when I got married, my father-in-law is a truck driver. And at the time I was thinking that would be so much better than being a pastor. And he told me, he said, you can marry my daughter if you promise never to become a truck driver, because that was his lifestyle and the hours are weird. He said, no, you need to be at home. so don't be a truck driver. So that eliminated that. And then I'm like, well, maybe I can drive the bread truck. Then I'm around during the day. But they just couldn't handle that there were times that I didn't want to do this. And so they left. So I was just feeling very down. They ended up at another PCA church where the pastor did not know that's why they had left. And so we were at a Presbyterian meeting, and he's so excited that this new member is at their church, and thank you for sending them to us. And I'm just standing there, like feeling like he's just twisting this knife into my chest, and I'm trying to, yeah, great. So I'm standing. We were at a restaurant. I'm standing in the outside fire pit, just standing there, thinking, this is awful. This is terrible. What am I doing? This just isn't working. Why am I here? This was all pre-COVID. And, it was awful. And so this guy who I knew, he was a pastor in our Presbyterian who had retired recently. He walks up and he's standing next to me. He says, Kyle, how are you? I said, I'll be honest with you, I am not doing well. And I just kind of explained it to him of kind of where I was at and just my frustration with where Westminster was at. We were in a major period of decline. Everything was going downhill. Questions of finances and attendance, and we were down to 50 people. And I mean, I said, I'm about as low as I've been in the time that I've been in Westminster. And he's like, yeah, you need to go to Africa. And I said, Africa? And he's like, yep. I said, go to Africa. That's the encouragement you need. When you go to Africa and you see what's going on in Africa, you realize that it's not really about Westminster. It's not even really about Roanoke in the United States. It's about the Church of Christ, and you'll be encouraged. And by the time we got to September, had gone through COVID, and I was actually feeling very encouraged. Our church had a major resurgence, and new people, and things were great. And but he's right. If you're ever depressed, you need to go to Africa. Of just the hunger and the desire and the one of the last things my wife said to me when I left was, I'm not moving to Africa, so don't even ask. she just knew that excitement would kind of take over. And I get that on every trip I'm on, whether it's Dominican Republic or Mexico or Jamaica or where that I've been the last couple of years of, oh man, this is where the church is at. And I'm in the States, of kind of that discouragement, but realizing the covenant promises of God continue. And yet maybe your little neck of the woods is struggling, but the church as a whole, God's doing great things. And the same for Israel of, they really wrestled with that after the exile, but those covenant promises are there even pre-exile, so that each prophet, as he's condemning them, and he's, even as Van Gemeren says, he's offering them that call to repentance, there's also the reminder of redemption, that it's coming. It gets emphasized more and more and more as repentance becomes less and less of an option. It's emphasized more in later prophets, but yet it's there even in Amos. At the very end, there's just kind of this hint of, this isn't the end. It's going to be a small remnant, but there is hope. There is going to be a restoration, and that came from Deuteronomy. Because even, the whole idea of exile came from Deuteronomy, but so did the idea of return, where God says, I will call you back from where you're going.
Where is that exactly?
I think it's 29. Hold on a second.
Christ in his final commandments kind of gives us the how the knowledge of the God is going to spread over the world. In the prophets, we get it's going to happen, and then Christ is like, well, yeah, because you're going to do it.
Yes.
You're going to spread it, and it seems like that's almost in Christ's prophetic role, almost like he's giving his command as a king and a priest to us, but it's almost like, yep, this is how the plan will happen through the church.
Yes, which some people have suggested that that's the same as Israel was supposed to be in the Old Testament.
Let's go over that command from Christ, not in the command itself, but in the fact that you read it, go out the whole world expecting conversion, and then all that I hear on it is, well, he told us that, but it's not going to work.
Yeah, chapter 30. Yeah,
It's pointless. I don't.
Yeah, the same is true of Israel in the Old Testament. They were supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. They weren't, but they were supposed to be. There is a missionary focus. In fact, I think there's a book, saw it around here somewhere. There's a big thick book on missions. I thought we have a copy, maybe it's down in the basement. By Winters is the editor. I had to read it actually when I was in seminary. But one of the major themes of that was dealing with the missionary efforts of Israel and what they were called to. And that at the time, even 20 years ago, was kind of a new theme of kind of picking up on, that the separatistic idea that was present at the time of Christ was not how it was supposed to be. That it was supposed to be, you're going to go to the nations. But even then, you see the irony of Jesus saying in Acts 1:8, you're going to go to the nations, and you could see them all like, man, how are we going to go to the nations if we can't eat with them? You could see them kind of debating that in their minds, because Peter, he doesn't recognize, well, this is what you were called to. This is what I said when I said you were my witnesses to the ends of the earth. They're thinking, oh yeah, there are Jews to the ends of the earth. They're thinking only Israelites to the ends of the earth. When he says ends of the earth, he means ends of the earth. There's a book called The Art of Neighboring, and the tagline is, what if when Jesus said love your neighbor, he meant your neighbor? Which is such a great line. We assume that love your neighbor means the guy who sits next to you in the pew, not the guy in your neighborhood, but recognizing, no, actually when I said light to the Gentiles, I meant light to the Gentiles. I meant that all nations will be blessed through you. I meant that you were actually going to make an impact on these other nations, in part because you would have this position of preeminence where the nations are coming to you for assistance. They're coming to you for borrowing and for military support, and the mountain of the Lord will be glorious. And the picture that's demonstrated is what it was supposed to be and wasn't, but he says, but that's what it will be. So it will become not this new thing, it'll be what it was always supposed to be. And just it wasn't.
Do you think we see glimpses of that, like when Jonah preaches to Nineveh and suddenly repent?
Yes.
Yeah. Or
Yes.
like Nebuchadnezzar when he decrees, okay, we're only going to worship
Oh yeah.
the God of Israel.
Yes.
So it looks like, man, the nations are ready, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
people weren't ready to go.
Yeah, man, Jonah is such a
Mhm.
convicting read.
Yeah. The story of Nebuchadnezzar is just, it still blows my mind. It's such a great story of, he takes out the first king of Israel, puts in the replacement, Eliakim, I think is his name, but then he changes his name to Zedekiah. But his name means Yahweh is righteous, which of all the names that you could come up with, he names Daniel Belshazzar or Belteshazzar, I can never remember which one. One of them is his grandson, one of them is Daniel. But he names him after his God. And it's got Bel, B-E-L in the name, but when he comes along several years later and takes out the king, it's no, Yahweh is righteous. And you see this, even the interaction, especially between Nebuchadnezzaradan and the head of the armies of the Babylonians and Jeremiah. He basically says to Jeremiah, yeah, God sent us. God told my king that we're supposed to go invade. We're here. And oh, by the way, he said we were supposed to find you and you can do whatever you want. You come with us. He has this conversation almost like he's a prophet. Like it's two prophets having this conversation. It's Jeremiah who knows what's going on. And the only other person who has any idea of what's going on in this whole interaction between Babylon and Israel is Nebuchadnezzar. And he's told his chief official, when you get to Jerusalem, go find Jeremiah and tell him you're here. Which is just, come on, he's an Israelite prophet, and you're going to go track him down because God told you to. And Nebuchadnezzar says, you know why we're here. We're here because God said to come destroy you. And I mean, it's just a fascinating conversation of who is this guy? And yet, yeah, Nebuchadnezzar all of a sudden becomes this tool of God and understands. He gets it. His son does not, and his grandson certainly does not. And then they get overrun by Cyrus and the well, not even overrun. They literally open the gates and invite him in because Belshazzar is such a bad king that they invite Cyrus, please invade us, please. And he comes and takes over that night and destroys the Babylonian line. Doesn't really destroy the city, it just takes over. But yeah, you've got these Gentiles who come to understand because of the Israelites. It would make sense that it's because of Daniel. Daniel is the one who evangelizes Nebuchadnezzar. He has that dream. He really learns that God is the one in charge. I haven't done a lot of research on Daniel, but I've been told that we have archaeological evidence that Nebuchadnezzar disappears and then shows up again, and that his son, I think it's Nabonidus, takes over for the interim period while he's gone. And lots of debate as to where he went. I think Daniel's pretty clear where he went. He went crazy. But he, even archaeology seems to confirm that he disappeared for a time. And when he comes back, he worships God. And even with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And, if you don't believe in the God of Israel, I'll chop you up in pieces. That's pretty convincing. He takes it pretty seriously. But, there's that light to the Gentiles that takes place. So at least within Israel, you've got the covenant promises, but also the covenant expectations. And that seems to be even one of the motivations of the prophets is the peoples will hiss at you and they'll whistle and they will understand because of the judgment that's going to come upon you. You didn't worship God. Even after they kick out the Israelites out of Assyria, they put in the Samaritans. Wild lions start going around and devouring people in northern Israel. And the Assyrians figure out that it's because they're not following the laws of God. And so the Assyrians take a bunch of Israelite priests and send them back to Israel to teach the Samaritans, here's how you follow God, which is kind of where we get the whole Samaritan quasi Jewish sort of, it's like everything about the Torah in the first 5 books, but with a Samaritan spin. But a lot of that seems to come out of that time period because even they understand, okay, Israel got kicked out because they didn't obey the God of the land. And our people will get kicked out if they don't obey the God of the land. So all of that is very much tied to covenant. It's very much tied to the expectations, perhaps not chapter and verse, but all of those expectations are there and are the underlying current to the prophets. So that like Elijah, they come along as these covenant prosecutors. In some cases, Micah 6, and I think it's Hosea 4, they actually do what sounds like a lawsuit of, okay, I'm gonna accuse you, and we're gonna walk through what you should have done and did not do according to the covenant. So it's there. Deuteronomy certainly has those themes that are part of that are part of the prophetic message, even if it's not specific. Well, it's 9:45. We've been going for almost 2 hours, so why don't we take a break?
That's good.
And let me see if I can. There's a way to.
2 hours on one question. That's pretty.
Yes. Yeah. There you go.
That's pretty good.
So the topic that I want to talk about now is this idea of justice. The prophets are very focused on justice, and it's a topic I hadn't really thought about. I was kind of aware of it, but this book by Abraham Heschel Heshel, the prophets, old book from 62, but it's he's got a big emphasis on it. As I mentioned, for those of you who hung out a little bit yesterday, it's actually, this copy is 2 books in one. He's written 2 volumes on the prophets. The first volume is really walking through the individual books of the prophets. The second book is really thematic. So he deals with prophecy and psychosis and prophecy and inspiration. Talks about ecstasy, which I mentioned it a little bit in the lecture. Ecstasy is pretty, that's kind of a mark of ancient prophets. And you don't see that in Israel's prophets, which a number, Lindblom has written a book on prophets. And he's got a huge section that he starts by surveying prophets around the world, from the whirling dervishes to other ancient prophets. The closest we ever come is to see Saul go into a frenzy, and but that's it. And that's more.
It's probably not a great time.
Yeah, it's more judgmental of Saul than anything, because he only ever responds to the Spirit when he goes into an ecstasy. The rest of the time he just ignores it. Whatever, when the Spirit rushes upon you, do what your hand finds to do. Well, I'm going to go home and not tell anybody I was just anointed king. That's what I found to do. So the only time, and it really bookends the life of Saul. He does it at the beginning and then he does it at the end. And both times there's that question of who is his father? Is Saul also among the prophets? That guy? The almost the incredulity of Saul as a prophet, and everybody sees it. And then you got David, a prophet, and nobody cares. Everybody's like, well, yeah, of course he's a prophet. But Saul, they're like, what, him? So that seems to be more the purpose of it. We don't really have any other ecstasy passages. It is something fascinating to think about, though, as the Spirit falls on the 70 elders in Israel under Moses. 68 of them are with Moses and begin to prophesy. 2 of them are in the camp and begin to prophesy. And you kind of wonder, what are they doing that people know that it's prophecy? And that kind of has always stuck in the back of my mind. What are they doing that people are able to say, oh, that's prophetic? Are they, what is it that they're saying or doing, or people know that, oh yeah, they've received the Spirit, they're prophesying as well. And I almost wonder if some of what we, again, the big picture idea, some of what we call prophecy is because we're so big on the foretelling part of it, that we miss that sometimes prophecy is just reminding people of that big picture we talked about last night of, Anna, Simeon, they're more or less prophesying over Jesus, but Anna doesn't really say anything prophetic.
Right.
Simeon only says the part at the end about a sword will pierce your heart, but that's not really new information. Right. I mean, it is, but it isn't. But even that's not really, the only reason we call it prophetic is because it's future. How would he know? But the Spirit has already told him, he's already been in communication with the Holy Spirit that tells him he won't die until he sees the one who's going to be the Savior of the world. So, now let your servant depart in peace. So, even there, he knows big picture, but he's not necessarily prophesying per se, but yet everybody around them is amazed at what Anna and Simeon say and seem to recognize that it's unusual what they're doing. So, I wonder if the 2 prophets that are still in the camp, they're not in this ecstasy, but they're proclaiming big picture items that most Israelites would not have thought of or not remembered. And if there's almost this element of, that sounds like Moses talking. Mm-hmm. Not so much of, my cat's going to come home and, I'm going to hit the lottery and, oh, thank you for that word of prophecy, as much as it is, just, that sounds like a Mosaic sermon that you're preaching, and you're saying Mosaic type words, you must be prophesying. And if they would have thought of it more in those terms.
That sounds like the day of Pentecost.
Mm-hmm.
when the Spirit comes in.
Yeah,
Proclaiming.
yeah, they're just proclaiming the mysteries of God.
And, Peter 2 weeks before was like, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel this
Uh-huh.
time? And, had no clue that, oh, this is Joel. What's happening.
Yep. Yep.
It's like he's been transformed and able to understand
Right.
the Old Testament in a way that he was.
Yes. So he's not giving new information, but he is, in a sense, prophesying big picture.
Yeah.
I think it's part of where, and I think he's on the right track. He just goes off it at some point, but that's where Wayne Grudem has just defined it as foretelling, forthtelling, prophecy type A, prophecy type B. That was before side A, side B kind of destroyed the letters, but prophecy A, prophecy B. We don't have prophetic in terms of telling the future, but he says that the gift of prophecy is the gift of preaching. And I get where he's going with it. I don't agree, but he's on to something there in terms of it doesn't necessarily have to be foretelling, but the offices of prophet and preacher in Ephesians seem to be spelled out as different offices, and they seem to know that the daughters of Philip were prophetesses. So I wouldn't make the connection between preaching and prophecy. Rightly so, we make a connection between preaching and priesthood, and part of it is that declarative function of this is the law, and reminding people of the revelation we already have. We don't have prophecy in that sense anymore, partly because we have the big picture now in Scripture, so we don't need to be reminded of the big picture or told the big picture, because the big picture is now revealed. We have everything we need, so we no longer need these big picture people. And yet there is a sense in which part of our role as pastors is to remind people big picture, but that doesn't make us prophets.
Doesn't the church have a prophetic voice though? In some sense, in the new covenant, that they're supposed to remind, not as much pastors reminding the people, but the church reminding the world. In a sense.
Yes.
That kind of feel, even though, we're not going to call any of us prophets, because we're not, but kind of along that idea. We're not saying anything new, but we're fulfilling the role of reminding you what's been said.
Yes.
Almost.
Yeah, I tend to go more, and I'm going to write on this someday. Haven't yet. I've got a whole list of things I say I'm going to write on someday. But one of them is that we use that term prophetic, and I would almost use the term priestly. That we're the kingdom of priests, and so we're speaking priestly to our culture. So I get what people are saying prophetic, but yeah, I'm almost more comfortable saying we speak priestly. True instruction is found in the lips of a priest, and that we're reminding people of what we already know rather than bringing that new information. So we're applying the law of God as priests, and priests have that role of judgment, even of you would go to the priest for the judgment, and for us as priests to say this is right, this is wrong. If we were to say the prophetic element, I think would be reminding the world where we're going. This is not the end. This is, again, that big picture idea in terms of what you did is wrong, therefore, this is wrong. I would almost say that's more of a priestly function of, abortion's wrong, how dare you? That's more priestly, to remind our president of, it's not about America, it's about the glory of God and letting the knowledge of God cover the face of the earth, and we're moving towards eternity. Don't lose sight of eternity. That seems to be more the prophetic function, is, keep looking ahead. This is not the end. It's not about the here and now. Yes, we have a priestly function now, but keep your eyes focused forward of the again, that I used the word last night of progressive, but not progressive in the sense that we think of progressive, but progressive in the sense that history is progressive. We are progressing somewhere, and to remind our culture that we're going somewhere, and even more so to remind the church. And that's one of the fascinating things about the prophecies, even towards the nations, is that they're not given to the nations. The only person who ever really speaks to the nations itself about what's going to happen is Daniel. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, here's what's going to happen. Joseph talks to Pharaoh, way back when. But within the prophets or the prophetic type books, since we don't always consider Daniel a prophet, more an apocalypticist, but more or less he's like a prophet. He's telling Nebuchadnezzar, here's big picture. But beyond that, Isaiah doesn't ever really go and talk to Cyrus. He tells Israel about Cyrus. Amos doesn't deliver those words to the nations. Obadiah doesn't really go to the Edomites. Nahum doesn't go to the Ninevites. But they're telling Israel that, so that the prophetic function is almost not so much reminding the world of the big picture as much as it is reminding the church of the big picture. And so that, if we were to say what that prophetic voice would be, again, I'd probably avoid the term prophetic, but if we were to say that pastors need to have a prophetic function as well as a priestly function, it would be that big picture of, yes, I know it looks terrible, but let's remember big picture. And that's probably been, if I can go off on a little soapbox here, I'm the professor, I can do what I want. That's probably been my one frustration with COVID, is that we had the opportunity to remind our churches and our churches as a whole of big picture, and we got bogged down a lot in the little picture of masks, no masks. Although I did see something funny yesterday that I had to chuckle. It said, if you're trusting God to protect you and not your mask, why are you carrying a gun? I thought that was kind of funny. I never thought of that. But that aside, we spend a lot of time talking about masks, talking about COVID restrictions, talking about those things. And yet Joel, when he prophesies about the locusts, and Amos even talks about the earthquake. Some people have suggested that there may have been an earthquake around the time of Haggai, potentially. They're not talking about the event itself. Joel looks at all the locusts and says, you think that's bad, just wait till the Assyrians get here. Or, maybe not the Assyrians, the Romans, whoever it is, depending on where you date Joel. You think this is bad, just wait. It's going to get worse, but it's going to get better. Like, this is all, we're moving forward. And to remind the church of that, I think that we missed an opportunity there to remind the church that COVID's not really the end of the world. And if it is, that's good. If it's not, so this spirit of fear that really gripped the church. And a lot of people did put their faith in masks, and a lot of people have put their faith in vaccines. And depending on where you come down on either of those, they're not necessarily good or bad, but they can't be the object of our faith. They're not going to bring about the transformation of the world. They're not going to bring about the second coming. They're not going to bring about the victory of the church. Those things have been accomplished through Christ, in Christ, will be accomplished by Christ. And that's where our focus needs to be in terms of that prophetic role of reminding people big picture and not just little picture, which is true of all of our preaching, but especially when we're preaching through the prophets of, the book title, Live Your Best Life Now. Sometimes we even give the impression of that in our church, because let me tell you how Amos applies tomorrow. And let me tell you how Isaiah applies to what you're going to face on Thursday. And there's a place for that. And again, I'm preaching 1 Corinthians 8 tomorrow. So let me tell you, what is the application of 1 Corinthians 8 on Wednesday when you're going to the ABC store and you start to feel guilty and think, oh no, I'm leading my brother astray, who doesn't exist, but I'm leading him astray. And maybe one of the things I'm going to say tomorrow is maybe you do have that person that is in your life that is going to stumble because you went to the liquor store and is an ex-alcoholic, and there's all these conditions basically that line up. Okay, fine, but maybe not. So maybe 1 Corinthians 8 doesn't apply on Wednesday. Maybe it does. But to remind people but the bigger picture is, what do I do with my knowledge, because I'm building up the church, because I'm looking to eternity, and kind of pushing that focus into big picture. I really like the way we came up with that last night, but that big picture idea, I think that's more that prophetic role, so that as you're telling somebody, and they're sitting there thinking, how does Amos apply to my life tomorrow? To be able to tell them, it doesn't apply tomorrow, but it's the hope of what Amos talks about that's going to get you through tomorrow, because you know that there's a restoration coming at the end, and you're longing for that, and you know what Christ has done. And so Amos is encouraging you, even if you can't say, verse 4 affects me when tomorrow when I'm standing at the water cooler, here's what I need to do because of this. No, I may just have the knowledge of, I need to not worry about the water cooler. That when I'm standing at the water cooler, there are more important issues going on than just what's happening at the water cooler. And especially within our lives, I think there's a lot where that happens, that we get so focused on the here and now that prophetic role is just that reminder, big picture.
Yeah.
That brings an idea to mind. It's not about anything you've asked today, but it kind of brings me back to your question from last night. Why do we need prophets? Is it possible that we needed prophets to be priests? At that time, the priests had failed so bad that we needed mediators between God and man, and they came to fulfill that. And there's specific roles that are just prophetic, but it seems like they do the job of priests, like you're saying. I think that insight really helped me. That priestly voice in the world.
Yeah, the prophets are coming and condemning the priests and trying to get the priests and kings to do what they're supposed to do. But then you have Christ, who is the priest and the king, who does what the priests and kings are supposed to do. So now you don't really need them, because now you have the priest and the king. So you don't need this kind of check and balance now on this other office. The office is complete. And we don't need the prophet anymore, because now we have all the scripture. So prophecy ceases when you have the canon, because now we have all the message. We have the big picture. We have everything that we need. We have the perfect prophet, priest, and king. So we don't need a check and a balance on those offices anymore. And we don't need ongoing revelation, because we have what we need. We have the big picture. We have, there's no more progressive revelation. We have literally reached the book of Revelation. We've gotten all the revelation we need. So, Hebrews 1 can say all things have been revealed in Christ. There's nothing else that we need or are required to have. So now our role then is to not so much be the prophet or to be the priest, but because we represent Christ as pastors and elders, we are still seeking to be under shepherds and almost under kings, under priests, under prophets. And to some degree, that's true of all of us. One of the best books that I've ever read on the topic was not published the way I read it. I was given an advanced manuscript of this book that a friend of mine was writing. I read it, absolutely loved it. I told him I loved it. It was fantastic. He published it. The editor destroyed it. It's okay. The book is nowhere near as good as it was when he wrote it. They took a lot out. But his basic thesis was that American culture is not transformed politically. It's transformed by talking to our neighbor. And that the way that we transform it is by being a prophet, priest, and king to my neighbor and in my culture. And so in my role as a Christian, the way that I have this incarnational ministry is by being a prophet, a priest, and a king. So I'm prophetically saying things to people. I'm serving as an intercessor and a priest. And I'm, as a king, he would say that the abortion issue is a king issue, that it's standing up and saying, no, this is not what we're going to do. We are going to do something different. And he actually used me as one of his object lessons in the book, both as a positive, and then he said what I should have done. Because we had a series of movie stores in Wisconsin called Family Video, and they're in a couple other states, but mostly Wisconsin. And there was this back room in the store, and I had a feeling I knew what was back there, but I asked anyway and just played stupid. I said, so what's in that back room back there? And he kind of looked at me and he said, what do you think's in that room back there? I'm like, pornography. And he's like, yeah. I said, do you make a lot off of pornography rentals? He said, yeah, 50% of our business comes from pornography. I said, you're called Family Video. And he's like, yeah. So I contacted the owner of the company and just said, you need to change your name. It's ridiculous. And I got this thing back about, oh, well, with the economy, we can't really change our branding, blah, blah, blah. So in his book, the first manuscript, he said that I was acting like a king there. But then he kind of critiqued it and said, I should have taken it the next level, and he gave some other suggestions of things that I could have done to keep fulfilling that kingly role. And but I would say that's true of all believers, but it's especially true of Christians who are pastors, that we stand in the pulpit as representatives of Christ, and we are largely doing a kingly, prophetic, priestly office, where we are, as elders, as shepherds, we're coming alongside people and saying, yeah, that's not right. Church discipline is really a kingly function. We're interceding for people, leading them to Christ. We're serving the sacraments. We're having that priestly function. And then the question is, okay, prophetic, what are we doing? And everybody's like, oh, preaching. But I would say, well, preaching, if we're reminding people of the big picture, because if it's just reminding people of God's law, then it's priest. If it's even just here's what you should do, that's king. But if it's big picture, don't forget the truth of where we're going, don't forget all this, then I would say that's where that prophetic part comes in. That we as pastors especially should be doing all of those. We tend to kind of lean more one way or the other. And I'm not sure I've ever heard a pastor accused of being too prophetic. Usually we're too priestly or too kingly. We're either too authoritarian, or we're just so big on the gospel that we almost become we almost ignore the law and almost become antinomian in some ways. And so to keep that balance between law and gospel, and yet also law, gospel, and big picture, having that element in our preaching. And it's something that I've never really thought about, because I hadn't really thought of prophecy in that sense. But we, even as I preach, I always make sure that the cross is there. So it's in every sermon. And yet to have that element, not just of the cross, but that reminder of this is what we're looking forward to. So it's not just about tomorrow I failed and I repent and I look to Christ, but looking ahead to that time when this isn't going to be an issue. And looking ahead to, there is no more weaker brother. There is no more, we're longing for that day. And even if it's just a sentence or two to remind people of, look at the big picture. We're moving somewhere. We have this tension now because of where we are now. So we have these issues over weaker, stronger brother because we're not perfect. But in glory, we won't have these issues. In the new heavens and new earth, there won't be debates over whether or not you could smoke a pipe. We're not going to worry about that. We'll all be smoking pipes. Any other thoughts or comments on that before we jump into justice here?
Do you think that, trying to tie this to the prophets, do you think that having a strong emphasis on the covenant or covenant theology is helpful in keeping the big picture for people? Calling people, so you're saved, but individually you're saved, and that's great. But God's made a covenant with his people, and you're part of that. It's bigger than you. So what's going on in your life is important to God, but it's part of what's going on in the life of the church.
Yes.
And his people, and kind of reminding them of that covenant aspect of your relationship with God.
Yes. I think that's, especially from a reform perspective, if we're thinking more where we're not attempting, we're attempting, but not to make visible church and invisible church the same. And having, as my one Baptist brother calls it, over-realized eschatology, where we're really emphasizing those two, but to remind people that's what we're working towards. And we're looking forward to that day when the covenant community will be purified. But to remind people we're not there yet. And we know that because we just admitted a bunch of children into our membership. And so we know they're not believers, but we believe they're covenant children. So we have work to do. And so, I think in terms of covenant community, having that covenantal perspective from Old Testament into New Testament does remind you it's about the next generation. It's about, it's not even about my children next generation, but it's about, older women pouring into younger women in Titus 2. It's about, leaving that legacy for the next generation, because it's not about me. It's about us. Yeah, so I think that certainly helps. And that's not to say that it's not present in non-covenantal churches, but they will probably have to work at it even harder. On the other side, because we're covenantal, we tend not to think of it. We just assume it.
Yeah.
And then we don't do it. And to remind people, if I had a nickel for every Presbyterian old person who has said, well, I did my time. Yeah. And no, your time is now. You didn't do your time. You think you did your time. Actually, when you thought you were pouring into the next generation, the older generation was pouring into you. Now it's your turn to pour into the next generation. And so actually, if anything, your time is more now than it was there. We got an elder here. He's not currently serving as a ruling elder, but he's been an elder in the past. But I asked him, I said, why did you choose to retire to the mission field when you left the company that you were working for? And he said, because retirement is not in the Bible. Elders go and sit at city gates. And so I had to figure out what city gates to sit at. And so he went to the mission field. And I actually got a little bit more of that story. He worked for the government, and he actually quit a year from retirement and gave up his pension to go to the mission field. So he makes it sound like, I was tired, I had no better to do, but it's a little bit more noble than that. Awesome. He got so excited about doing computers on the mission field that he retired early and went to China first, and then which is funny, he's one of the greatest hackers that has ever lived, and he went to China as a missionary. If the Chinese knew he was there, he would have been in big trouble. So, but he's actually the one who coined the term Trojan horse for computer viruses back in the 70s. Yeah, he's a smart guy. But yeah, he just said retirement's not in the Bible. And even now he's in his 80s, and we just asked him this last cycle if he wanted to be an elder again. And he said not right now, but he'll probably be an elder again, because he doesn't view it as I'm done. I'm just, he always calls it life in the fourth quarter, but game's still going on in his mind. Right. And yeah, which is encouraging. But that should be more true in a covenantal perspective. It's not just that you rotate through, but that you're always part of the covenant community. When I was in college, there was a book. There was a series of books called 4 Views on the Millennium. 4 Views. There was one 4 Views on Youth Ministry, and the question was: are the youth the church of today, the church of tomorrow, or there was a couple options. There were obviously 4 of them. I can't remember the other 2, but it was this interesting debate, and realizing that if you don't come from a covenantal perspective, the kids are not the church of today, they're the church of tomorrow. And so they have nothing to offer right now. They just, someday when you're older, then you can contribute. And yet from a covenantal perspective, they have something to contribute now. We also have something to contribute to them. And we are working towards us as a community growing, but we're not there yet. So yeah, I think you're right. A covenantal perspective has a great impact on not only how we view the prophets, but even how we view our role as pastors today and what we're calling people to. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And again, not to say that covenant theology is the only way you have to view it. Obviously, it's the way I view it. But if people from other perspectives should still have that viewpoint of we are all important, but it's going to be more of a challenge for them.
That seemed for me one struggle with talking to Baptist friends is that idea that the new covenant equals eternally.
Yes.
Right. So if you're saved, you're in the new covenant. If you're not in the new covenant at all.
Right.
And so the church becomes really a voluntary organization, really. Because the real church are the saved people.
Right.
So a lot of people here aren't really part of the church in any sense.
Yes.
Because they're not saved.
Right.
So then the big picture really isn't there. It's all about me, Jesus, salvation.
Yep.
And these people are just kind of hanging out.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, having a doctrine of the visible church does change how we approach church and how we approach big picture. Because you can fall into that trap of assuming we're already there because we're the baptized members, so we are the church and we're here, rather than we are becoming the church. We are the church. We're becoming the church, but the work of the church is not yet done. We've not yet arrived.
Because I see in non-reformed churches that are in service.
Mhm.
Because in the prophetic times,
Yes.
I think the kids would be right next to the parents hearing the prophet speak.
Absolutely.
And today it's like, well, they're not the church. They haven't accepted Christ yet, so they can't hear these things.
Yep.
And it's interesting to me.
Mhm.
That's not, at least biblically, how it would have been done.
No.
They would have heard
Yep.
the words of God.
Mhm.
That's always been my thing is, well, what about the Lord's Prayer? Do you teach your kids the Lord's Prayer if you don't believe they're part of the church?
Right.
How can they say our Father?
Yep.
That kind of, like I said, you take covenant, it seems like a lot of these prophetic issues are rooted in covenant. Whether it's how you do the Mosaic Covenant or how you do the covenant community.
Yep.
Just a slight nuance can change everything.
Yeah. It is fascinating that we have, even here in Roanoke, we have several Reformed Baptist churches that are Baptist and yet act covenantally.
Right.
So they're almost inconsistent in some ways. They're so big on family and they understand the importance of family because they read it in scripture. And so they grasp that. And so, even though they're not necessarily covenantal in their theology, they're covenantal-ish. And some of that comes from the Reformed theology, because even the best Reformed Baptists still understand the Old Testament is covenantal. And so there may be a break between the covenants of the Old Testament and the New Covenant, but they still understand there is a series of covenants. It doesn't abrogate everything that came before. So they will see their children active in the Old Testament, so then they have them active in the New Testament, even though they don't view them as part of that covenant community yet. So it is one of the fascinating things of in trying to explain the doctrine of infant baptism even to a Reformed Baptist. And they just kind of sit there as you're explaining it and they go, yep, I believe that. Yep, I believe that. And you're thinking, I'm using all my best arguments here and you're agreeing with me and coming to a different conclusion. Yeah, but they still have some covenantal aspects to it. It's when you end up with more of an extreme, almost non-denominational at times, where you got the kids in the gymnasium playing basketball during church, or they're in Sunday school during church. They're not actually in worship. We don't want them in worship. I actually have friends who have visited various churches around the United States that are actually told, please don't bring your kids to worship. It's not even that it's optional. It's no, we'd rather they're not in worship. We used to have children's church here, and somebody asked me, do I have to send my kids to children's church? And I said, no. And if I can figure out a way to kill children's church, I will. And I've been working on it for years. Thankfully, COVID did it for me. But no, I want your kids in worship. That's where they should be. And I get the arguments for children's church, but I think if we can make do without it, we should. I think it's more biblical to go without children's church. I understand it's age appropriate, but there are certainly elements of them participating in worship that are important. And we know that because we usually have an age cutoff and say, no, you can't go to children's church anymore, because we know you need to be in worship. So even to start them younger and just say, even if you're just going to sit here and you're fellowshipping with the people, there are elements of church that are different than just hearing a sermon. And you get to still participate in those elements of the fellowship of the saints. You hear the singing, you're participating, you're part of the family. There's a communication of church rather than just we all conveniently showed up here at the same time. We almost view church sometimes like a restaurant where, oh, isn't it neat we ended up at the same restaurant at the same time? That's cool. No, this isn't we just ended up at the same restaurant. This is family. This is the family meal, and we're here as family. And so if you're not here, there's an empty chair that should bother us. And even if that chair belongs to one of our children and they're in the nursery of, okay, you're in the nursery because, yeah, we don't want Bella, screaming and yelling and she will disrupt everybody. But, we're not that far off from you can sit and watch Barney for half an hour. You can sit here for half an hour. And, we're going to make sure that you learn that, no, we don't do that in church. You're old enough. And, for every child, that's a little different in terms of age, but there comes a point where, yeah, you're going to sit here with us. And some parents have children that have a personality that from infancy, they're in the church service and they never go to nursery. And that should be applauded just as much. I wish that I could do that with Isabella. That's not going to happen. Maybe if there were cookies involved, that might work. But yeah,
They pushed me to originally to Reformed faith. At previous churches, my family and I, we'd go to church and we'd be in.
Yeah.
We'd all be doing something different because it's either they don't want you in the service because you're this age, or they need you to do help here, and because there's so much production involved.
Yeah.
They split families. And I never sat.
Yeah.
So, it's like, I don't. How does that?
Yeah.
Why? So I don't know. I just, something special. Even if you can't understand, seeing even your parents take the means of grace is a means of grace to you in a way.
Yes.
That's one thing I appreciate about you and Sean. It's the first church I've ever been in that explained what happens in the Lord's Supper in the service.
Yeah.
At work, I mean, honestly, they did it more than once every 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, well, that too. Yeah,
So-
that's becoming more common, unfortunately.
So,
Yeah.
it's just, and if it's for kids, even though you can't take it,
Yeah.
it's like, well, what does this mean?
Right.
And how are you going to learn that if you're not with your parents?
Yep. Yeah, I was at a I don't know, because I don't know enough about the church to know kind of what their view is of children in the service, et cetera. But I was surprised. I was just teaching a Bible class and I asked a bunch of 8th graders a question. Why did Jesus have to die? No, that's not what I asked them. Why did Jesus have to be God and man? And they couldn't answer the question. I mean, they had no idea. And specifically, I was trying to get them to understand why Jesus had to be born at Christmas as a man. And they just could not wrap their minds around it. Now, I have a 15-year-old son who doesn't pay attention to anything and is mildly autistic. And I came home and I'm sitting at dinner and I'm complaining to my wife about the question. He's not paying attention to the conversation. He's eating. And when he eats, he's like off in his own world. He's only focused on the food. He's not even paying attention to the conversation. And I looked at him and I said, hey, Tyler. And he stops eating and he looks at me. And I said, Tyler, why did Jesus have to be a man? And he looks at my wife like, why is he asking me such a stupid question? And he looks at me and I said, no, really, why did Jesus have to be a man? And he almost gets like this look of disgust on his face. Like, I can't believe that you would ask me such a simple question. Who do you think I am? And he's like, well, Jesus had to be a man so that he could die. I'm like, okay, I didn't think it was that hard of a question. I just wanted to make sure that somebody knew and that I didn't have too high of expectations. So here's my 8th grade, 15-year-old, 9th grade, 15-year-old son with autism who doesn't pay attention to any class he's in, and yet he understands it. Yeah. And yet, a whole Bible class of Christian school kids that couldn't understand it. And I think a lot of that does go down to he's in church every Sunday and he's always hearing it. And we're always talking about it. And it comes up in the sermons and it comes up in Sunday school. It comes up in all these areas where we're together as a church family, just solidifying it over and over and over again. I don't know that he and I have ever sat down. We do the children's catechism, but I don't know that we've ever sat down and gone through a theology lesson on why Jesus had to be a man. He picked it up because it's all we talk about.
That's kind of what happened. I mean, that just makes sense why that's why their worship service during the time of the prophets was just to read the law.
Yes. Because
it wasn't like, all right, come take this class. It's come listen to what God has said. Yeah. And you'll just absorb it. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yep. That seems to be what's lacking at the time of these prophets. Yeah. There has been no law being read.
Yeah, we don't get any mention of preaching until Nehemiah chapter 8. That's kind of the first. Moses is preaching a sermon, but he's not preaching a sermon on a text in Deuteronomy 8, but he is preaching. But Ezra is the first one to read the law and give its sense. He's probably doing that because it's in Hebrew and they don't know Hebrew. And so he's probably translating it and expounding on it. But yeah, prior to that, they would just read it. And it is amazing, as important as preaching is, there is a lot to be said just about reading it. And I mean, I've often said that with men who are intimidated about leading family devotions. So just read it. You don't have to give a sermon. You don't even have to give any thoughts on it. If somebody asks you a question, write the question down, bring me the question, I'll give you the answer, and you go home and tell your kids what the answer is. It doesn't have to be complicated, but just constantly washing them with the water of the word, just reading it to them it speaks for itself. And yes, we can, give questions and I mean, it is fascinating to me that we are a Reformed church. We're a PCA church. We believe Reformed theology. I don't know that I really preach per se Reformed theology from the pulpit. I just preach the Bible. And my kids are Reformed because I just preach the Bible. And the number of churches in Roanoke that I've talked to since I moved here, that their churches are now Reformed. But if you ask the average congregant at that church, is your church Reformed? They don't even know the category. They don't even know what you're talking about, because they have not come from a Reformed background. They're not in a Reformed denomination. When you say Reformed, a lot of them will actually say, no, of course not. And then when you start asking what they believe, you realize they're actually more Reformed than they know, but they have hired Reformed pastors who are just preaching Bible. And they think that, they look at their Bibles and they're like, well, yeah, of course that's the truth. Because the pastor says, look at verse 6, look at verse, he's just appealing to God's word, and they become not even convinced of a position, they become convinced of the truths of Scripture and the doctrines of grace because they can see it, because it's just simply being preached to them, not as a theological expose, but because they're just sitting under it. And that's true of our children as well. They're just there, they're just sitting under it, and they're learning God's word because they're there and they hear it. And they may not pick up on everything, but they hear enough. I mean, my daughter doesn't do it anymore, but she used to not take notes. She actually have a piece of paper and she would write down every word I said she didn't know. And then we would sit in the car on the way home and she would just run through the list. Dad, what's this word mean? What's this word mean? What's this word mean? And I deliberately have always tried not to use big words, but sometimes those church words come out and I tried to define them, but a couple times she would miss the definition. So we would, Dad, what is sanctification? Dad, what is regeneration? What is justification? Dad, what is atonement? What is, even this week, the same daughter, she's like, why do you keep using that word atonement? I said, because that's what it is. It's not a word I came up with. It is atonement and it atones. And so even be able to talk through that, but that's because she heard it. She heard it just because she was there. So that covenantal perspective, and it's clear, not just from a Deuteronomy perspective in the prophets, but the fact that the whole nation is going to go into exile, all of them. Ezekiel's the only one that mentions that there's a differentiation between those who are righteous and are marked by God and those who are not. And yet in the same book, Ezekiel seems to suggest a lot of righteous people are still going to die. So they're marked by the angel that goes out and numbers them. And yet he basically says, I think it's Ezekiel 9, he says, the righteous are going to get swept away with the wicked, which is the very thing that Abraham accuses him of. Are you going to swipe away the righteous with the wicked? And he says, no, of course not. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right? And yet here is God basically saying, look, I deal with you as a covenant nation, and you are all going to go into exile. You and your children and your little ones, and your little ones are going to be killed before your eyes. And it's always this big family, big nation perspective. It's not just you, O king, have failed, so you're going into exile, but your kids, your kids are going to be slaughtered before your eyes, and then your eyes are going to be put out. You're going to be dragged in chains to Babylon. And that's what happens. But it affects the kids. It affects the old people. It affects everybody, because it's a covenant people, and so God even deals with them, even in the prophets, deals with them on that covenant family level, covenant nation level, that the nation as a whole has sinned, therefore everybody's going to get punished. But then on the flip side, the whole nation is going to be brought back, at least the ones that survive are going to be brought back. But not because every single person that comes back believes, but because enough of them believe that they come back. So there is still that benefit even for the Israelites to come back to, as part of the covenant, to come back to the promised land because of their association with the believers in Israel. So it does work both ways. And the children are certainly included in that, which is one of the reasons why traditional Presbyterians then emphasize the inclusion of children in the covenant in the New Testament, is that they were included in the Old Testament. So it seems natural to include them in the New Testament. It's not always just an easy, well, we'll include them in the New Testament because we're in the Old Testament. I had a Baptist friend accuse me of being inconsistent in my theology because I don't believe in paedo communion. And he explained the logic of why you should believe in paedo communion. I'm like, I completely agree. And it's just that there's that one verse that hangs me up about, discerning the body and blood of the Lord that I always struggle with. But, Passover, whole family's involved. So there is, you have to, if you don't believe in paedo communion, you have to believe that there's a break of some sort. So it's not just one for one if you don't hold to paedo communion. If you hold to paedo baptism, we can say there's a 1-to-1 correlation, but even then there's a break because circumcision is only for boys. And now we're baptizing boys and girls. So even there, it's the same, but it's different. And yet you still see the idea of covenant, which is why even if you don't hold to paedo communion, children should still be present as you're taking communion. It's not that they're left out. I've seen some churches that will actually bring the nursery, will come into the back of the sanctuary when it's time for communion, because they think it's important for all the children from the youngest age to the highest to be a part of the family meal, even if they're not actively participating. They're participating even though they're not eating. And I think that's an important element to keep in mind, that even though communion, if you go with a non-paedo communion viewpoint, even though communion is only taken by communicant members, it's not just something communicant members do, but that it's something that even non-communicant members and even non-members should be doing. So oftentimes we will challenge even non-Christians. Here's what you should do for the next 5 to 10 minutes while we take communion. Here's what you should be thinking about so that you can participate with us next time. You're not just a bump on the log and you're not just watching us, but you should be doing something and reflecting upon what we're doing, why we're doing it. And, even children, I think that would be an appropriate time to challenge children. If you're of a certain age, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you a church member? Why are you, 18 and still have never publicly declared your faith in Christ? That's not normal. You should be a part of the family meal. So I think there's elements there, whether you're paedo communion or not, to be able to still include the covenant. And churches that are non-paedo communion tend to overemphasize the division to the point that we make it seem like kids are just sitting there. And to be able to challenge them of, no, you're doing something. You may not be eating, but you should still be doing something. Obviously, if you hold a paedo communion, don't worry about that. Yeah, then the issue takes care of itself. Yes. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Is it difficult to have an 18-year-old who's never?
In the Dutch tradition, yes.
Okay, I know that they're
the Dutch continental.
Really high bar.
They do. We really struggled with that in Wisconsin because there are so many Dutch people that join the PCA that they don't encourage their kids to be members. And even within the PCA and other reformed non-paedo communion denominations like the PCA, the OPC, there's often a delay. If there's a delay, I think the delay should be on the part of the parents, that the parents are not yet willing to hand over the authority. Explaining to your 10-year-old, this means that Elder Jim is going to come talk to you if there's a problem. He's not going to go talk to dad. But I've had we had actually an elder in my last church whose son was 17, and he's like, you better not talk to my son without talking to me. And our senior pastor looked at me and said, you handed that authority over. So yeah, maybe they should talk to you because you're his father, but they're no longer required to. He now answers directly to the elders. So, 14-year-old girl gets pregnant. It's not just a mom and dad and girl issue. Now it's an elder issue. Now it's a church discipline issue. Now it's not just, hey, mom and dad, make sure you're taking care of this, discipline your child. Now she's a church member. So now we as the elders are getting involved in church discipline, and parents are sometimes uncomfortable with that. But I mean, my nephew was probably 7 or 8 when he became a church member. Girls tend to mature quicker, so they tend to be a little younger when they become members. My 2 sons are not yet members, but all 4 daughters are. And my one son, Tyler, I'm still working on. He's actually a little nervous about it, which is healthy, but not healthy all at the same time. Yeah. And my other son, Caleb, I'm not sure is even regenerate. So that one I've kind of dragged my feet on. But within certain traditions, they end up being older, which is not always healthy. So we want parents to understand the seriousness of it and what they're handing over, but to tell the parents of, your 7-year-old can't be a member because they're not old enough. I think there's an artificial thing that we put in place there. Usually I'll just ask parents, you realize what you're handing over, and do you think that your 7-year-old is mature enough to vote for the election of an elder? And I think your average 7 or 8-year-old knows if that elder's a jerk or not. So I think they're perfectly capable. But even my daughter Aubrey, who's 13, she asked me at our last election, she said, who should I vote for? I said, well, who do you think you should vote for? Well, why do I have to decide? I said, because you're a church member. And I said, do you think that they make good elders? They've both been elders before, you know who they are. So do you think they'd be good elders? Oh yeah, he's a nice guy. Like, okay, why do you think he's a nice guy? Well, I had this conversation with him. I'm like, there you go. See, you're perfectly capable of making this decision. You don't need me to tell you who to vote for. So, I think part of that covenantal perspective is putting more trust in our children. An Israelite would have been 12 when they became a man. Which should maybe challenge us in how we view our kids. Yeah, sure. So the idea of justice. This is easily my favorite chapter in the whole book. So again, I recommend this book by Heschel. He asks the question, why should religion, the essence of which is worship of God, put such stress on justice for man? Does not the preoccupation with morality tend to divest religion of immediate devotion to God? Why should a worldly virtue like justice be so important to the Holy One of Israel? Don't the prophets overrate justice? He says, perhaps the answer lies here. Righteousness is not just a value, it is God's stake in human history. Which I thought was an interesting quote. God's stake in human history. He says, God needs, and he's using this word need not as actually needs something, but God needs mercy and righteousness. His needs cannot be satisfied in temples, but in history. It is within the realm of history that man is charged with God's mission. Which, when we think of, again, this idea of mission and light for the Gentiles and loving our neighbor, and it all takes place within history. And that's actually, this first volume only has 2 topics in it. He deals with the books of the prophets, and then the 2 chapters that he actually deals with topics are history and justice. Those are only 2 topics he deals with in this first volume, everything else in the second volume. But the prophets are in history, and they're dealing with God in history. So again, that big picture idea, and yet that they're dealing, the application of this is in history. They're not timeless. So they're not just coming along and offering these esoteric truths, but they're dealing historically. with what is going on around them historically, and reminding Israel how the immediate events fit in. Haggai is probably the most obvious. Once more he's going to shake the heavens and the earth, but that's in that time frame when Darius has taken over, and it's about 515 BC, and Darius has taken over, and actually it's earlier than that. It's like 505 BC. Darius has taken over. There's been this great collapse in Babylon, and the Persians and the Medes are running things, and Cyrus will be on the scene soon, and so this major upheaval. And actually Cyrus has already come, Darius is after him, but you've got this major upheaval in history, and he's looking at that and saying, yeah, but he's going to shake the heavens and the earth again, not just with these historical events, but there's something even greater, a greater shaking that's coming. And the prophets will often do that. Even Amos, he looks at all the nations and he gives judgment, but he talks about judgment because of things that have happened in history. Ezekiel talks about, the destruction of Tyre and Nebuchadnezzar, and Isaiah talks about Assyria and what's going to happen with Assyria. Assyria is going to come, Assyria is going to do this to Israel, but I'm going to do this to Assyria. So they're dealing within history, within world events. It's not just timeless, but then justice is taking place within history, and the two are interconnected, and are designed to be so. How would we define then justice?
Can I ask a quick, just beginning question? Because someone asked you last night, and I was going for the answer. I went to the bathroom.
Yeah.
So in Greek, you've got dikaiosune, which is righteousness or justice.
Right.
Could be translated. Is it the same in Hebrew?
Can be. We have
Mishpat.
mishpat, yep, which comes from the verb shofet. So that's to judge, and that can be justice, but you can also have zedekah, which is also righteousness, and you can have either of those be justice. He says here, while legality and righteousness are not identical, they always coincide, and that the second is reflected in the first. So righteousness is reflected in legality. So there is this idea of righteousness that is caught up in justice. I think in some ways you could almost say that justice is righteousness applied to someone else. That, even if I want justice for myself, I'm expecting someone else to give it to me. So even then it's others focused. They have to give me the justice. There's something that they have to do. And if I'm going to do justice, then I'm going to do justice for someone else. So to do justice always seems to involve other people. Yeah. Although he does say here, it would be wrong to assume that there was a dichotomy between mishpat and kindness. Justice was not equal justice, but was a bias in favor of the poor. Justice always leaned towards mercy for widows and orphans. Divine justice involves God being merciful and compassionate. Isaiah 30, verse 18. Therefore, the Lord is waiting to be gracious to you. Therefore, he exalts himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait in him. Which, again, in our minds, justice and mercy don't go together, and yet they go together. There used to be a song years ago by, I think it was by For Him. Mercy Came a Running. I think that's For Him. Mercy Came a Running. And yeah, one of my friends told me, he said, that is my favorite song. And he said, what do you think of it? I said, that is my least favorite song. And he said, really, it's an awesome song. I said, but it's so theologically inaccurate. I can't stand it. He said, well, what's wrong with it? I said, well, the line is, with justice no longer in the way, mercy came running. I said, but mercy takes place in justice. That justice is poured out on the cross. God does not abrogate justice. God does not ignore justice. He actually performs mercy through justice by justly condemning Christ on the cross for our sins. So there's no injustice, and justice isn't just not in the way. Without justice, there is no mercy. And for him, completely missed it on that. My friend said, "Thanks, you killed the song for me." I said, "Good," because it's a horrible song. But that's really how God's justice works. Justice for the poor is mercy. Justice for the disenfranchised is mercy. And they're not even two sides of the same coin. They're actually the same side of the same coin. That justice and mercy really go together. But we just don't typically think of it in those terms.
You were asking what is justice? And first thing that came to my mind is the law of God. Because the law comes directly from God's character, and we tend to separate law from the lawgiver. But with God's law, he can be defined as his attributes. He is justice. Like true justice would be found in the law of God and the principles of God. And I wonder if that's another shadow of Deuteronomy. That justice is the law of God that you've forgotten.
Yes.
And I don't know, it kind of struck me, maybe in our rightful reaction against theonomy, we have maybe gone so far as we can't take principles from the law of God.
Right.
That while we don't institute those laws today,
Yes,
there are principles in the law that reflect his justice and mercy that
absolutely.
maybe we've unduly forget. We've reacted. We've gone so far that we don't even.
Yes.
And that's what I've appreciated about, there's about people like Vaughn said, who have pointed out, like, even if you don't agree with me, principles still please God.
Yes.
Even that parapet around the roof.
Yep.
It's not about building the parapet around the roof.
Right.
If someone's coming to your home, you keep them safe.
Yes.
You salt your driveway if it's snowing out and you have people there.
Yes.
That's and so I wonder.
Yeah. It changes how we read the law, because it's not just letter of the law, it's spirit of the law, and spirit of the law is actually more severe. We tend to think of, well, I just hope they go with the spirit of the law in this. The spirit of the law is far more strict. It's not just don't hate your brother or don't kill your brother, it's don't hate your brother. It's don't even call him a fool. It's not even don't have an affair, it's don't even look lustfully at a woman. Or actually the way Jesus says it, don't even look with the intent to lust, even backs it up a step prior to that of, the spirit of the law is more strict. And you're right, we dismiss the law rather than looking at the spirit of the law and realizing that, it's not just about the parapet, it's about loving my neighbor. And that I do that in all sorts of different ways. Everybody hates OSHA, but OSHA is good. Kind of feel like Maze Runner. Wicked is good. OSHA is good. They can be obnoxious, but they do exist for a good reason. Nobody likes being fined from. Somebody told me once that OSHA stands for, if you're a worker, our savior has arrived. And but if you're a business owner, it's oh shoot, him again. And kind of depending on your perspective, and yet it does good. It protects us, and we should follow building codes. Churches are exempt from most building codes, and yet there are building codes that we should probably follow. The ADA requirements are not typically enforceable in churches, which creates loopholes that are nice. We redid our stage up on the front, put in a different step arrangement, which under ADA you can't do without putting in a ramp. Well, we don't have room for a ramp. And so somebody said, well, you can't do that then. And we were able to say, well, actually, we're exempt because we're a church, so we don't have to follow ADA. So we'll put in it. If we have a pianist or a musician that is handicapped, we'll put in a ramp. But we don't have that right now, so we're not putting in a ramp. But at the same time, when we have somebody in a wheelchair, we can't roll our eyes and say, oh, you ruined everything. Because that's not loving our neighbor. That's not being merciful. If they need to get up to the pulpit, because we have a pastor in a wheelchair, we got to put a ramp in. It's that simple. So there are principles that are there. And I think you raised a good point of oftentimes when we think of justice, we tend to think more of the mishpat, the shofet side of it, the judgment side of it, of you broke the law, so now you get justice. Instead of realizing actually the doing of the law is doing justice. We use that word justified, and we tend to think it more of in a justification sense. You weren't justified, now you are. But somebody who is that tzedakah, that righteousness, that justice that exists, they are not one and the same, but they are very much related in that the law is just, and it is justice embodied. So not even in a judgment sense, but just the doing of the law is just, so that we could say there will be justice in eternity. Not just justice has been satisfied, but no, the ongoing glorifying of God is justice. It is the justice, the righteousness of God lived out in history is justice. We tend to go with the other side of it. He even says justice could be described as the active process of remedying or preventing that which should arouse the sense of injustice, which even from a positive sense would be true, because we've got the law of God, we follow this. The opposite of this would be injustice, so justice is making sure that we follow the law so that we don't get that. So, it doesn't always have to be remedying everything that we label as injustice. It could be preventing. It would be unjust for us to do this because it wouldn't be righteous. It wouldn't be holy. It wouldn't be loving my neighbor. It wouldn't be the fulfillment of the law. So I'm not going to do it. And it may look different in each particular era, but, at the same time, maybe it doesn't. Maybe somebody comes to me and says, I want a loan. Will you loan me some money? And am I allowed to charge interest on that loan? In certain cases, maybe. Maybe somebody comes to you and says, look, I'm starting a business, and if you'll loan me $10,000 to help start my business, I'll give you a stake in it. I'll give you a kickback on your investment. Okay, makes perfect sense. Or a person comes to you and says, I need a new roof and I need this much money and I don't know when I'll be able to pay it back. And okay, it'll be 10% interest. Okay, now I'm not being so just. Now I'm not really loving my neighbor. But in the first instance of, I'm loaning you capital and we both win. I'm helping you start your business and I'm making some money in your business on the side. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a prohibition as much as it is what would prevent injustice here, what would prevent abuse of the poor, what would prevent, and I think that's part of why, he says justice is biased towards the poor and the weak, but it is, but that's part of loving your neighbor. And, again, we talked about reparations a little bit last night. I think the motivation behind it is good. I'm not opposed to reparations biblically. I'm opposed to reparations economically and philosophically. I think biblically, yes, we should be seeking out injustice and seeking to remedy it. I'm just not convinced reparations are the way to do it. But that also becomes then a point of Israel is the church in the Old Testament. So for them to say we can't have injustice in Israel is the same as we can't have injustice in the people of God. The two go together, one is the same. So we're going to make sure that we follow the justice, the law of God. In the New Testament, the United States is not the same as the church. And I think one of the errors that we have sometimes made is that it's the church's responsibility to eliminate all injustice in the United States. And that might be an application of the people who are in the church living out the gospel. And it might even be a declarative function of the church to declare to the church, this is wrong. But is it our job as the institutional church to fix all the injustice in America? No. And there are some issues where we're okay with it. Like if we say we as a church are going to take a stand, we're going to be actively involved in the pro-life movement. everybody applauds that. If we say we're going to be actively involved in rooting out racism in our culture, you get a lot of eye rolls. That's certainly not as popular. But I would make the argument actually in both of those, that it's not the job of the institutional church to take on abortion. It doesn't mean that we can't be involved in the pro-life movement, but we need to be careful that we don't lose sight of the gospel for the sake of the pro-life movement. Now, I have always thought that I should be doing street evangelism in Roanoke, and I've often intended to, never have, although we're starting an internship program here at Roanoke, or here at Westminster, that's going to be part of it. So I'll have to do it with my interns. So that'll be good. But I've often thought, okay, I see pastors standing across the street picketing at Planned Parenthood. If I asked those same pastors, would you go do street evangelism with me in the Walmart parking lot? How many of them would agree to? My cynical side says none. I don't know. I've never asked because I don't go. So, this is kind of the kettle, what is the fire calling the kettle black, or the pot calling the kettle black? I'm just as guilty as they are. So I don't really have ground to stand on. But there are times, I think, where we become distracted by good things. That yes, as a church, we should be proclaiming justice. Yes, as a church, we should be calling people to justice and righteousness. We just need to be careful that we don't lose sight of the fact that the prophetic office in the Old Testament is different because of what they're dealing with. Calvin could get away with it because he was working in a town where the church council was very much the city council, which ironically he was opposed to. People always forget that. He didn't like the church and state were connected, but that was the reality in Geneva, and he used it to his advantage. We have a different situation here. We can't do that, but we should encourage our people to run for office. We should encourage our people to contact their senators and their governor. We should encourage our people, but we need to make sure that we're focused on the gospel and the call to righteousness and the call to justice, rather than us institutionalizing it. We're not a battleship. We're an aircraft carrier. We refuel the airplanes. We send them out. As an institutional church, our target is the kingdom of Satan, not Planned Parenthood, and we need to keep that division the same.
I think you're right. I think you're talking about like our call to justice and holiness. That's the point of Deuteronomy. I think sometimes the temptation is, as Christians that we do have it, is to look at Deuteronomy and Leviticus and be like, well, I'm saved from that.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yes.
It's like,
yeah,
I can't use that.
Yep.
But you, especially in your preaching, like, no, this is for, it's in the Word of God. It's as if Christ said it to us.
Right.
And so I think looking at it as, this is your call, just as much your call as the church as it was theirs. Because I think there's a lot of people would be like,
oh yeah,
we read this so we are thankful we don't have to be like that.
Right.
It's like, well, no, you do, and the calling's even higher.
Yep. There's been a movement I've seen within Baptist circles. They refer to it as principalism. I think that's how you say it. That there's these principles that are in the Old Testament that you pull forward into the New Testament. So you need to ask yourself when you're interpreting Old Testament text, what's the principle? But it's funny when you hear them, they're like, oh, that whole moral, ceremonial, civil law thing is ridiculous. and then they're like, you got to find the principle. Kind of look at them like, what? And one of my professors said that. He's like, the challenge is you don't know what is moral, what is civil, or what's ceremonial, so they're artificial categories. I'm like, so we're basically arguing over semantics here. I called it moral law, you're calling it a principle. And, so it's almost you're holding up this straw man of Calvin's division and then torpedoing that when that's not what we're saying. But even within Baptist circles and dispensational circles, that's becoming more, they're beginning to understand, through guys like Carson and Beale, and New Testament used to be old, and they're beginning to understand a little bit more about principles. And even MacArthur has done a lot to encourage that of, we can't dismiss the Old Testament, even if he just uses it as illustrative material, but he does, he has a commentary on the whole Old Testament. So, he hasn't dismissed it. He still writes on it. He still pulls principles out of it. He still applies it. So, you do get that pulling it forward, which is important. And a lot of that boils down to the idea of justice but justice more in line with righteousness rather than judgment.
I think Paul definitely shows us that example when he says, "Don't puzzle the ox when it treads out the corn." That means pay your pastor.
Yes,
You know,
yes,
God cares about animals. How much more would he care about the guy who's
That's it.
doing up the work for you?
yep, absolutely.
And, I've heard people also use the, don't see the kid in its mother's milk.
Uh-huh,
And, an observant Jew will say that means I can't eat a hamburger with cheese,
right,
dairy and meat.
Yep.
And, God doesn't care about dairy and meat, but he does care about taking something meant to give life
uh-huh,
and using it to kill.
yes,
So, like if you're doing family devotions every day with your kids, and that's great, it's supposed to give them life, but they're just miserable because you're like, sit for 2 hours while I read to you.
right,
You're bullying your kid in as much. No.
yeah,
That's
that's
the
a
principle that
interesting
you're pulling
application.
forward.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
so all of those laws, they have the moral law behind them.
yes,
Just being applied to a specific civil people.
yep,
We can take those moral laws behind the law,
yeah,
like the parapet. We don't build a parapet around it, but we ice our
uh-huh,
driveway.
right,
We salt our driveway.
yeah. I think this is where the whole social justice movement has gone wrong in our reaction to social justice, is that our reaction has been to almost act like we're antinomian, and that, oh yeah, it's only about the gospel, justice doesn't matter.
Right.
And rather than coming alongside and saying, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with the principle of how you started, your application is wrong. That it's not just about social justice. Why am I interested in justice? Because I'm interested in the glory of God. Why am I interested in why am I interested in saving the life of the unborn? Why am I interested in these things? Well, it all flows back to the gospel, but I didn't just stay with the gospel. And some of it, I think, within within this movement towards social justice, smacks a little bit of German liberalism and modernism, and a little bit even of an overinflated Kuyperianism of I know that Kuyper is quoted a lot by Presbyterians and people in the Reformed tradition. He says some crazy things. And every once in a while you realize they have not read Kuyper. They've just gotten that quote from somewhere of his views of the connection between this world and eternity is he says whatever we redeem in this world continues into eternity. That's why we need to redeem it here, because if we redeem it here, it will be present in eternity. And Sean, my associate pastor, often says, I'm happy to talk about redeeming the arts when you're willing to talk about redeeming ditch digging and redeeming the guy who cleans sewage. When you want to talk about redeeming that for the gospel, then I'll talk about redeeming the arts. He said, it is fascinating that the things that we're going to redeem are all things that rich white people like. And that should be telling.
Yeah.
That we never talk about redeeming the other stuff, but if that's the theory we're working off of, then let's redeem ditch digging. How do we dig ditches to the glory of God? And that is a question we should be asking, but that's not a question. It is a question that Kuyper says you should ask, but it's a question that nobody who likes Kuyper asks. And so yeah, we get this idea of, well, we need to eliminate social injustice because then in eternity there'll be no injustice. And I would go more of, no, we need to eliminate injustice because it's a hindrance to the gospel, because it's not how God would have us lead creation. And we have a cultural mandate as well as the Great Commission.
Yeah.
But the church has not been given the cultural mandate. The church members have been given the cultural mandate. The church has been given the Great Commission. That's our primary purpose, to glorify God by making disciples. We make disciples by teaching them not to do injustice and by even encouraging them to break down injustice. But we should not have pastors who spend all of their time debating reparations. And that's kind of where we've gone off the rails. But then our response has been to be almost antinomian and just say, well, let's just not worry about justice. But justice is, justice, righteousness, it is the law. And it comes from principles of the law. So to dismiss the one is to give the impression we're dismissing the other. I don't care about justice. Nope, don't care about justice. Well, what if I punch you in the face? You're suddenly going to care about justice. You're going to care about it then, but I thought we didn't care about that. I was joking around with my wife. There's the Christian school that I work at has you sign a statement that says, I won't drink. And I think there's like 6 or 7 different things on there: drinking, gambling, pornography, affairs, sexual promiscuity, and but it's during the school year. And so I commented to her, I said, so I can drink in the summers because I'm not a school employee during the summers. Can I have an affair in the summer too? And she didn't think it was as funny as I thought. I thought it was hilarious. But yeah, so she did not agree. But I think sometimes that's the impression that we give of the law. Well, I don't worry about justice. Well, what's your wife think about that? We're very inconsistent with just about everything. But that's another area where we're inconsistent. So the prophets come along and they are very concerned about justice, but more so because of that, they're concerned about that second commandment, love your neighbor, but also as the love your neighbor as yourself, but also love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And for them, the two are closely connected, almost completely connected. What is the great commandment? He gives 2. Now he does say the second, he labels it the second. So it's not like in our Westminster Confession where we say, the chief end of man is glorify God and, wait a minute, I said is, not are, but we give 2 answers to the one question. Jesus is not giving 2 answers to one question, but he is giving 2 answers to one question. They're not the same, but he says, look, you can't just have one commandment. It's not just love God. It's love God, love man. So the prophets are concerned about both, but they don't just target the one, they target both. That you are involved in false religion, but you're also involved in injustice in how you treat your fellow man. And you need to repent of both of them because they're connected. Because if you have one, you'll have the other and vice versa. And if you don't, that's an issue. And so they're really targeting that. I like this line. He says, the major activity of the prophets was interference. Remonstrating about wrongs inflicted on the people, meddling in affairs which were seemingly neither their concern nor their responsibility. A prudent man minds his own business, stays away from questions which don't involve his interests. But the prophets were given no mandate by the widows or orphans to plead their case. But a prophet is a person who's not tolerant of wrongs done to others, who resents other people's injuries, which is, is quite fascinating. So Deuteronomy 16 says, righteousness and only righteousness you shall pursue. And so he says, this carries strong connotations of effort, eagerness, persistence, inflexibility of purpose. It implies more than merely respecting or following justice and walking in the way of righteousness. Righteousness may be hard to attain. It may escape us if we do not pursue it. So hearken to me, says Isaiah in 51, hearken to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. So what the Lord requires of man is more than fulfilling one's duty, Micah 6:8. To love implies an insatiable thirst, a passionate craving. To love means to transfer the center of one's inner life from the ego to the object of one's love. So as we're loving God, we end up loving the things that God loves. And what God loves is righteousness, because he is righteousness. What he loves is justice. And so it's not even so much an issue of that's injustice and it bugs me, and so it needs to be fixed, as much as it is I understand the passion of God, that God is passionate for righteousness, which on the one hand I think also has a caveat to it, in that, let's just take reparations, since I keep mentioning that. Let's say we do reparations. Let's say we decide economically, philosophically, that reparations are the greatest thing ever decided. And so we're going to pay reparations. We pay reparations to all the people that have been hurt. So, if we're being consistent, not just African Americans, but Native Americans and all the German Americans that we threw in prisoner of war camps, Japanese Americans during World War II, and Chinese people that we butchered when we were building the railroads. And, we're going to pay reparations to everybody. Money is flowing. Everybody's equal. We've achieved this utopia. Is culture really just at that point? If we define justice as the righteousness of God, can it really be just?
Yeah, I mean, not really.
The reparations would need to flow from a just society, not because of a just society. So you have to be just, and then that could be an avenue that you take.
Yep.
But if you just do it with the hopes of becoming just, the actions itself are not
Right.
a just society. It has to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the gospel has to be included in it, because
Bingo.
once the gospel changes hearts, then we won't be arguing about reparations. It'll be, well, how do we promote justice in the society? Because we have been changed and forgiven. And so that has to be, the actions we take shouldn't even be our discussion almost. It should be Christ. And then how do I live because of what Christ has done?
That's right. I'm not sure which granting foundation it is that I hear every once in a while on NPR. I want to say it's the something Schofield Foundation, working to make a more just, verdant, and I forget what the last word is, society. And that in a sense is what the church is working towards, but we do it through the gospel. And you're right, the justice flows from being just. And I think that's part of why the prophets are most upset about injustice. It's not, yes, they're upset that it's hurting their fellow man, but the people are not just. So the injustice is more a symptom of the fact that they are not just. And so it's revealing they don't have a love for man and they don't have a love for God. So the way to become just is not just to, because, what has he required of you but to do justice and to love kindness and walk humbly with your God. So it's not one or the other. It's not do justice, love kindness. It's also not just walk humbly with your God, but it's be just people because you have a relationship with a just God and you're pursuing justice, you're pursuing kindness and love and mercy because your God is a just, kind, and merciful God. So you're doing loving kindness because he is full of loving kindness.
Right. So would it be accurate to say justice is doing what God would do in a situation? And so if that's the case, then we can't do justice apart from the gospel, apart from the spirit inside of us.
Yes.
The church is the only group of people that actually has the ability for justice. So you can make that argument. That you're not in the church, you really can't attain it.
Right.
Because we're the only ones clothed in the righteousness of Christ.
Yeah. This is really where the social justice movement is not new. It's kind of resurgence in the last 5 to 10 years. But around the early 1900s, it was really big. And it was written, there was a guy who wrote a book called In His Steps. And that was kind of the watershed book of and I can't remember the guy's name, but that's him. Yes, that's him. Yep. And he asked the question, what would Jesus do?
Right.
And so when a Dutch Reformed church in the 90s, when their youth pastor popularized the "What Would Jesus Do" movement, he was not, or she, excuse me, was not aware of the fact that that there was some history there. Yeah. So all the Reformed church history people were horrified, but it was well intentioned. Right. And I wore a WWJD bracelet when I was in high school and had sweatshirts and hats and all sorts of stuff that said WWJD on it. And the pushback, I think it was Sproul and Ligonier, was what did Jesus do rather than what would Jesus do. We can't devolve into moralism, and yet at the same time there is an element of truth to it. And so, in our typical fashion, we just bash WWJD and even Conan O'Brien was bashing it for a while. What would Conan do? And, that became kind of popular in culture, both in Christian and non-Christian circles. But there is an element of truth to it. The prophets were passionate about what they believed God was passionate about. But what God was passionate about was the justice of his people, not just destroying injustice. They point out injustice, but really it's a call for justice. And I think that's probably one of the things that has gotten lost in this whole social justice movement now, is that it's not just eliminating injustice, but it's calling for justice. And so, yes, if I'm pursuing justice, I will work to eliminate injustice, but it's not just going around and eliminating all the symptoms, because that doesn't necessarily take care of the heart of the issue, which is my unjust heart.
Right.
And
I think that's a big problem with the social justice movement, is it assumes the perfect innocence of the victim.
yes,
So everybody's either oppressor or oppressed, and the
Yep.
oppressed are innocent.
Yep.
But in reality, the oppressors and the oppressed are also oppressors.
yes,
They're oppressing other people. So nobody is not an oppressor.
that's right. Yep.
And there may be some particularly bad oppressions that go on.
Uh-huh.
They should be righted, but that doesn't mean that the person who's being oppressed is given a status of, I am the innocent one. I'm gonna
Right.
just decide what justice is.
Uh-huh.
Well, what about the people you wrong?
Yep.
You see
Yep.
what it's caused
So-
now that people feel like they have to join the oppressed group to feel good about themselves. That's why I think we have so many transgenders, because you're a white guy, you are a terrible person, and you're oppressing everyone. So why not become oppressed?
Yep.
And become,
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
don't even know, once you chop yourself up, whatever that is.
Yeah.
because then you're justified.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, it's the it's the Monty Python. Look, the king is oppressing me. That's really what it comes down to. This is probably sums it up the best. It is not only action that God demands. It is not only disobedience to the law that the prophet decries. Hosea 7:14, they do not cry to me from the heart. Or Isaiah 29:13, this people draw near me with their mouth, honor me with their lips, their hearts are far from me. Their fear of me is a commandment of men learned by rote. So Heschel says, the fault is in the hearts, not alone in their deeds. Their heart is false, says Hosea in Hosea 10. And same Jeremiah, thou art near in their heart, near in their mouth, far from the heart. So break up your fallow ground. Circumcise yourself to the Lord, remove the foreskin of your hearts, men of Judah. So that's really what it comes down to, is this idea of justice, and especially within Israel, as he goes on, he says, justice refers to the actions which contribute to maintaining the covenant, the true relation between man and between God and man. So it's not just a legal sense as the administration of law. Instead, it's upholding the covenant. But again, not everybody's in the covenant. And so, I have this cultural mandate to pursue justice, but also recognizing I'm working to be restored to people who cannot be restored to me, because we're not in the same covenant. They're still depraved. They're still unjust. Fixing their economic situation may be a great idea, may help them economically. It's not necessarily going to help them spiritually. In fact, in some cases, it might actually damage them spiritually, depending on what kind of love we attempt to show them. So that's really the heartbeat of the prophets, is of pursuing justice covenantally, pursuing justice because God is passionate about justice, but it's the justice of the hearts, not just actions. And that has been very much so lost in this idea of social justice, of what about the heart? And that has changed by the gospel. So we can certainly teach on social justice, but almost more as an example to show why we are not just, and to call people to repentance, rather than let me call you to action without a heart change. Because the actions will look differently for different people. you know, one of the things that I fear, even if we did reparations or whatever, is that people would assume the problem is fixed. That, well, I paid my check, you know, they added to my taxes.
Right.
Done.
Doesn't do anything to your heart.
Nope, doesn't do anything to my heart, and it doesn't prevent me from being unjust to the next guy.
And now you can be full of resentment for having had to write that.
Right. Yep.
Almost like,
Yep.
you know, I desire mercy and not sacrifice.
Yes.
It's like the action
Yep.
in and of itself is not even.
Right.
It's, it's the heart
Yeah, we could almost say I desire justice, not reparations.
behind it.
Which,
Write that article.
Yeah.
write that article, that's right. On that controversial note.
You'll definitely have to, so that's what happened.
Yeah.